The Joy of the Morning, a serialized historical Christian romance. Sonnets of the Spice Isle, Book 6. Written by Lynnette Bonner. Narrated by Mary Sarah Agliotta. Part 1. Psalm 30, 5. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Freedom. On the plains of the savannah. RyAnne sank to her knees and relaxed back against her ankles. The cook fire she'd been bent over for the past several hours was not but smoking coals now. She rubbed her fingers into the cramping muscles of her lower back. Despite the pain, she couldn't feel anything but relief to know that all the people of the encampment had now been fed. Several parties had even already departed to return to their villages. As different chieftains located what was left of their people, many hadn't wasted time in taking leave of the white man who, to their way of thinking, might change his mind at any moment and clap them back in irons. This morning, after Trent rescued the captives, Keiko had located the men and women of his tribe and freed them from their shackles. Some of the men he had taken with him on a hunt. The others had been set to releasing the rest of the captives, building up cook fires, and fetching water for those who were too weak to go to the nearby creek themselves. RyAnne had cleansed and tended as best she could, more wounds caused by the chafing of manacles than she could stomach. Partway through the day, after she had washed the ankles of a vacant-eyed girl of no more than 5 years of age, the frustration and heart-wrenching empathy had taken the last of her composure. Trent had discovered her with tears streaming down her face as she cleaned the wounds of the next child, and had made her change jobs with June, whose task it had been to make porridge. RyAnne couldn't deny that the change of scenery, from blood and blisters and glimpses of white bone through ebony skin, to bubbling porridge with steam wisping from it, had been a most welcome contrast. With Bagamoyo only a couple days ahead of him, Khalifa had nearly depleted the supplies he had been feeding the captives. RyAnne hated to think what the meals would have been like over the next few days. She and Trent had found a meager supply of cornmeal, however. The porridge had been thin to make it stretch further, but they had done their best to make sure every person ate a decent meal by including pieces of game from the gazelles Keiko and his men had bagged. Trent had broken up 2 fights between parties when fear had made them grapple over scraps. The first sight of food on the heels of weeks of near starvation had the tendency to transform people into hoarders. It had taken some convincing on the captain's part for everyone to share equally. RyAnne knew the portions had been insufficient, yet even at that, they were much more plentiful than the people had been fed for the past weeks. Some of the captives had been so hungry that they hadn't even waited for the meat to cook, but had simply devoured their portions raw. RyAnne shuddered. She was hungry, but she didn't think she would ever be that hungry. The thoughts of food penetrated her consciousness, and her stomach loudly protested its emptiness. She had doled out the last of the thin gruel as a second helping to Muyu, and there was nothing left in her pot. She should go see if any meat was left, but she couldn't seem to work up the energy to rise now that she'd relaxed for a moment. She glanced over and noticed Muyu and Niimbo seated together on a rock. Their heads were tipped together, and Muyu was sharing her bowl of porridge. A smile tugged at RyAnne's lips, even as exhaustion draped her shoulders. Though she'd been watching the 2 of them off and on all day, she could still hardly believe that her long nightmare was over. They were all reunited. Weeping may last through the night, but joy cometh in the morning. The verse soothed her in that moment. Perhaps her morning had finally dawned. A bee buzzed around her shoulders, and she swept a hand at it. As she twisted to make sure the bee was flying away and wouldn't get caught in her hair, one of her ankles pressed against a sharp stone. She gasped and shut her eyes at the severity of the pain. She eased her hip to the ground and carefully lifted the hem of her skirt to examine the ankle. It was red and swollen and looked like it was getting infected. On the long trek, she tried her best to keep the broken skin clean, but it appeared she was losing the battle. Footsteps sounded, and she quickly tossed the hem back over the injury. Trent sank down, balancing on the balls of his feet beside her. Resting his forearms against his knees, he clasped one wrist with his other hand. His gaze flicked down to the torn lace edging near her ankle.
"Are you okay?"
A furrow tucked into his brow. "It's nothing." He studied her expression for a moment, and then in one swift move he reached out and flipped back the hem. "Captain!" She slapped his hand away and clamped the material firmly in place over her throbbing joint. She could tell that he had seen all he needed to see. He pinned her with a stern look.
"It's infected."
Another wave of exhaustion swept over her. "I'm well aware of that. Perhaps Jabir will have left something in his tent with which I can treat it." He reached for her hem again.
"Let me get a better look."
She refused to budge. "It would be most improper." His mouth pressed into a thin line of irritation.
"What was it your father used to say? Let us leave proper for Stonetown parlours, and consider what would be safest and most prudent on the savannah."
She could almost hear Papa's voice saying it, and she couldn't help a sad smile as a bittersweet pang of nostalgia gripped her. Apparently sensing he'd put her in a melancholy mood, Trent lifted one hand and touched her cheek.
"You look done in. Did you eat?"
"I will. In a moment. My porridge pot is empty. I was just resting for a bit before I went in search of some food." Concern crinkled his eyes.
"Please, tell me you stopped at some point today to eat at least a little something."
She plucked a pebble from the ground and rolled it between her fingers. "I'll be fine. There were so many hungry people. For weeks I've wanted to feed them. Today I got to see that dream come true. What are a few hunger pangs in the face of that?" He bent forward and pressed a kiss onto her forehead.
"You have one of the most beautiful hearts of any woman I know."
He eased back and tipped her a chastising look.
"But in order to care for others, you also have to care for yourself. Wait here. I'll bring you a plate. And while I'm gone, I want you to prepare yourself to let me look at that abrasion. I have a feeling it might be worse than you are letting on."
She bit her lip, unable to deny now that she pondered on it, that her ankle had been shooting small pains up her calf all day. Perhaps a little.
"Ry."
There was despair and displeasure with her, all wrapped up together in that one little word. All the love for this man that had been building inside of her over the past months surged to life in her chest. It was almost too painful to breathe. She reached out and curled her fingers into his beard. "I can't believe you are here. Close enough for me to touch." He caught hold of her hand and kissed her palm.
"I'll only be a moment."
True to his word, he returned with a plate filled with scraps of meat, several loquats that some children had discovered in a nearby grove, and a gourd full of steaming broth. The broth smelled heavenly, but she wondered where it had come from. At her questioning look, he shrugged.
"There was no porridge left, but June had set some of the bones to boiling for a meal later this evening. It likely won't be as tasty now as it will be later, but I figured you needed the nourishment."
The broth tasted like a bit of heaven when she sipped it, and the first morsels of meat. She gobbled much too quickly for propriety. Her hand trembled when she reached for the first golden loquat. A muscle in Trent's jaw bunched.
"I failed you yet again. I did not realize you were so hungry."
She smiled around the bite of luscious plummy fruit. "I didn't realize it either until I started eating. Don't be so hard on yourself."
"But I am."
He snatched a blade of grass in disgust.
"I should be."
He transferred his troubled gaze toward the horizon. RyAnne cleaned her plate and then set it aside and reached over to clasp his hand. "I've just been pondering on a verse. Weeping may last through the night, but joy cometh in the morning." She squeezed his fingers. Once the dawn arrives, not many look back and consider what they endured during the night hours. They simply move ahead with their day. So let it be with us. We have come through the night, both slightly scathed, but whole. And now the day stretches out before us. Trent stood to his feet and pulled her with him.
"Aye, that it does."
He scooped her up suddenly. She gasped and threw her arms around his neck. He strode toward the tent that the healer Jabir had used on their eastward trek. It was pitched at the center of the encampment, as usual. He ducked through the entryway and then set her on the cot inside. He left the flap of the tent open, but they were mostly concealed from the prying eyes of the few left in the camp. He lit a lantern and then held it high, searching the contents of the tent.
Jabir departed with one of the parties earlier this afternoon, but all of his supplies are still here.
There was a leather satchel on a nearby table. He opened it and probed at the contents inside.
You are the nurse. What should I be looking for to soothe that infection?
Weariness clung heavily to RyAnne's eyes. Honestly, the best thing I know to do is just what I was doing this morning for the wounded. Clean the area with soap and water, and then it should be wrapped in a clean boiled bandage. But of course we don't have any of those. A light application of carbolic acid would be good if any could be found.
None of these vials are labelled. Trent slapped the bag closed in frustration.
RyAnne hung her head and worked the muscles along her neck. She didn't want to have to make a decision right now. Yet if she didn't do something, the infection would only grow worse. Trent was suddenly back at her side. He squeezed her shoulder.
Rest. I will return in an hour with hot water for a bath.
She eyed the empty space of the cot next to her. Jabir must have taken his bedroll, as there were no blankets. But the cot did look ever so inviting. Trent slipped out and let the flap of the door fall closed, enveloping her in semi-darkness. She slumped onto her side and let the oblivion of sleep claim her. Feeling a helpless roil of frustration, Trent stalked across the encampment to put water on to boil. She needed bandages. Where was he going to find something to suffice? He looked around as he walked. Other than the areas of still crushed grass littered with a few abandoned ivory tusks and discarded manacles, and the 2 tents that remained standing, one would never know that just this morning hundreds of poor souls had been chained up in this field. Most of the captives had scattered immediately after receiving their allotment of food, just as he'd suspected they would. His goal had not been to fill them, really, but to give them enough sustenance to go on their way with the energy to do their own hunting and picking as they journeyed back to what was left of their homes. June was still by one of the fires, seated on a rock. He smiled at her as he approached.
Did you eat?
She nodded. He gestured to the fire.
Can you build it up while I go fetch some water from the creek? Miss Hunter will need to bathe.
June nodded. And once he had the large pot over the fire, he decided that now was as good a time as any to see if Khalifa's tent would reveal any of the man's secrets. Frustration coursed through him as he stomped toward the tent. If only he'd had more time to question the man, he might have learned whom he worked for. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but when he flipped back the canvas, he knew he hadn't been expecting the well-supplied, meticulously organized environment that greeted him. The cot had a feathered mattress on it beneath sheets that were still rumpled due to Khalifa's hasty exit this morning. A large silk rug covered most of the floor space inside. An extra pair of boots were tucked neatly beneath the end of the cot. There was a small portable desk with a lantern atop it, a fountain pen lying to one side, and a chair before it that sported a feather cushion. Next to the lantern rested a silver flask. He sniffed the contents. Whiskey. He grunted in satisfaction at that and set the flask back down. RyAnne's wound would have its disinfectant. The only other thing atop the desk was a shaving kit. Trent scratched at the itch of his beard with another noise of satisfaction. It would be good to rid himself of the annoyance of it. Beneath the desk and off to one side were 2 freestanding wooden drawer units, stacked one atop the other. Each had a keyhole, and both were locked when he tugged on them. He glanced around. He didn't see any keys, and there was nothing else in the tent. Taking the knife from his belt, he pried at one of the drawers. The locks were not strong, and it only took him a few moments to open a crack large enough for his fingers to get a good grip, and then he wrenched it open. The drawer had no stop and came completely out of the casement, slipping from his grasp. Rolled-up pieces of parchment and folded letters tied together with ribbons flew everywhere. Trent growled and set to picking them up. He went to work on the second drawer then, and opened it more carefully. It contained more of the same, letters and parchments. Lips pinched in curiosity, Trent lit the lamp, sank onto the chair and started reading. Most of the letters were from a woman, a guess only, since they were written in Arabic that Trent couldn't read. But the script was delicate, and the pages smelled of sandalwood and a sweet citrus-like perfume. A mother. A wife? Trent tapped one of the missives against his palm. Keeping correspondence from a woman was a rather sentimental gesture, not something he would have credited to Khalifa. He studied the stationery again, more carefully this time, yet found nothing out of the ordinary. With a grunt of frustration, Trent stacked the letters together and set them to one side. Several parchments contained drawings of slave ships with instructions for how to best load the ships to ensure maximum capacity of cargo, depending on the type of vessel. The drawings, depicting people lying side by side on shelves that left not even enough room to sit up all the way, made his stomach curl in disgust. He tossed them down one after the other. There was a small stack of blank Harcourt stationery. After those, there were 2 parchments left. These contained a series of dates and numbers that Trent could only assume were the number of captives seized on each date. Trent tallied the figures. 997 people. That was the number of captured. How many others had been deemed unfit for transport and left dead and dying in the wake of Khalifa's raids? He closed his eyes at the sick feeling of it. He massaged his fingers over the headache beginning to build just behind his brow. The evidence of such blatant inhumanity, jotted down so casually, and now clasped between his fingers, fluttered in proportion to his rapidly growing outrage. After only a moment, he crumpled the pages into a ball and squeezed tight. His hand trembled. He tossed the parchment down. No evidence of whom Khalifa was working with. "You'll never find it." Khalifa's last words taunted his memory. He hadn't said, "You'll never find him," as one might have thought, but it. Evidence? The fact that Khalifa had mentioned finding something meant there had to be something here to find, didn't it? He glanced around, then searched carefully inside each of the drawers again. Nothing. He overturned the cot, stripped off the sheets and blankets, felt every corner and portion of the feather mattress. He would have torn it open in his frustration, except that he considered it might make RyAnne's next few nights a little more tolerable. The material was thin enough that he would have felt if there were any hidden items, even letters, in it. Next he turned the cot over and searched the underside, running his hands all along each seam to feel for any oddities. Nothing. He sank to his haunches and scanned the interior of the tent again. After only a moment of pondering, he strode to the desk and removed everything from it. He examined it from every angle, turned it upside down, shook it to hear if anything rattled. The folding legs didn't sound hollow, and there were no hidden compartments that he could find. The chair received his examination next, with the same results. Nothing. Trent propped his hands on his hips and studied the walls of the tent. The canvas appeared ordinary in every way. If he were Khalifa and had important information to hide, what would he do with it? With that many people set to arrive in Bagamoyo just days hence, Khalifa would surely have ships scheduled to be there, ready to take on the cargo and move it. Khalifa could have planned to sell some captives in Bagamoyo, Trent supposed, but most would likely have been loaded onto ships. Information about that had to be somewhere. "Mizzy?" Keiko's voice came from outside the tent. Disgusted with his lack of success, Trent snapped up one of the sheets, strode to the flap, and stepped out onto the grass outside. Spear in hand, Keiko stood waiting for him. "June has asked that I tell you the wash water is ready. All the meat from the 10 gazelles we brought in this morning is gone. I'm going out to hunt for our evening meal." Trent clapped the man on the shoulder. "Thank you, Keiko. I know you've had a long day, and I appreciate your help." Keiko shrugged off his thanks. "Legs that will not walk shall later find themselves hungry." Trent nodded. "Yes, indeed." He went to June then and asked her to carry the hot water to RyAnne, and while she did that, he filled the other pot with water and put it over the roaring fire. Using his knife, he cut a strip of material off the end of the sheet. and as soon as the water boiled, he poured off a good measure into a bucket, and then dropped the strips of the sheet into the water left in the pot. He set it back over the fire to keep boiling. The bucket he carried back to Khalifa's tent. He intended to have a bath of his own. If he was going to care for RyAnne, he needed to keep his own wound properly cleaned, and he couldn't wait to rid himself of his beard. RyAnne couldn't believe how good it felt to sluice warm water over her skin. There was only a razor-thin piece of soap left, and nothing to scrub with, but just the human act of rinsing dust and sweat from her skin made her feel a bit of her old energy returning. After she washed, she even rinsed her hair in what was left of the water, and wrung it out as best she could with her hands. Her dress and petticoats were still rank and dusty, but they were the only garments she had, so she shook them out and slipped them back on. She had just finished that task and turned her attention to Jabir's medical bag to see if she could find something to treat her ankle when she heard footsteps outside.
RyAnne?
Yes, Captain. Come in. He'd been right in his assessment earlier. None of the bottles in Jabir's bag were labelled. She couldn't use any of this without knowing what the various powders and potions were. With a sigh, she turned to face the entry. Trent entered with a still steaming pot, and she saw him wince as he bent forward to set it down. Concern turned her to fully face him. Are you well, Captain? In all the hubbub today, I realize I have not asked after your wound. I know Khalifa shot you, as I saw it with my own 2 eyes. Trent placed one hand to the opposite shoulder and worked his arm in a circular motion a few times.
He hit me high on the chest, in the shoulder. June pried the bullet out, but infection did set in. They said they made a pact with God, that if I pulled through, they would serve him.
RyAnne's joy bloomed on her face. Truly? He nodded.
To be honest, until a week and a half ago, they thought I wasn't going to recover.
All concern for her own ankle and the excitement over his news drained from her, leaving only cold fear in their wake. She strode toward him and snapped her fingers. Off with that shirt, Captain, and let me see the wound. He smiled softly, captured her hand, and tugged her closer. His gaze roamed her face.
I've missed your stubborn high-handedness.
She pressed her lips together and pinned him with a look. I'm not high-handed. Now off with that shirt. He chuckled.
Nothing high-handed about that now, is there? And the answer is no. I just washed and made sure to clean my shoulder carefully. There's no infection in it anymore. Your ankle first.
He dropped a quick kiss against her lips, and that was when she noticed he'd shaved off his beard. She touched his jaw, relishing the feel of his freshly shaved skin. We'll make a stubborn pair of old goats, you and I. A twinkle gleamed in his grey-green gaze.
And one of us is going to have to learn that the other is more stubborn than they are.
A quirk of his lips let her know he was teasing her. And for some crazy reason, she was suddenly in a capitulating mood. Fine. She sank onto the edge of the cot. But as soon as I clean my ankle, I will feel better if you let me look at your shoulder. He bowed his agreement and moved the steaming pot closer to her.
Thanks to Khalifa's sheets, you have your boiled wrap.
He motioned for her to hike her hem. Despite her embarrassment at the impropriety of it, she stretched out her leg and tugged the skirts up till he could see her broken skin. He grunted.
It does look a portion better after being washed.
He pressed gently at the area around the wound.
How is your pain?
She swiveled her foot this way and that. It's not too bad, unless something presses right against it. I think if I keep it clean from here on, it should heal up in the next day or so. Having the bandage will help with that. His lips twisted.
Thank the Lord for Khalifa's fondness for finer things. Like sheets, eh? Oh, and I almost forgot.
He pulled a silver flask from his back pocket and held it up, wiggling it for her to see.
And whiskey.
She started to smile at the joke when she realized what his intentions with the alcohol were. He held it above her ankle, one eyebrow lifted as though to ask if she was ready. Gritting her teeth, she nodded for him to get on with it. Trent drizzled a portion of the whiskey over her wound. Her gasp lifted his concerned gaze to her face.
Sorry.
It's fine. She took a breath and motioned for him to finish. After another torturous splash of the alcohol, he wrapped the hot bandage around her ankle. He looked up.
Too hot?
She shook her head. No, I actually think the heat might help kill some of the infection also. I'll be fine. He went back to smoothing the bandage and then tying it off.
You're all set.
He tugged the hem of her skirt back into place, and then met her gaze. At the loving look in his eyes, RyAnne's heart thudded against her breastbone. He leaned forward, and his hands were warm when they settled against her cheeks.
Now that we have reached our morning, I'm reminded that I had asked you a rather life-altering question and had not yet received an answer when Khalifa so rudely interrupted us.
A question? She pretended forgetfulness and placed one finger over her lips as though deep in thought. You had asked me a question, Captain? His lips curved.
Indeed, and as I recall, I had mangled it rather badly. So let me remedy that now.
He moved the pot to one side, took her hand, and settled to one knee before her. RyAnne covered her mouth with one hand. As tears filled her eyes, Trent's expression blurred, making it nearly impossible to see him. She dashed them away, not wanting to miss a moment of this. Trent traced his thumb over the back of her knuckles.
I remember the first time I saw you. Did I ever tell you?
She shook her head and stayed her breath, the better to hear him. With a faraway look in his eyes, he smiled at the memory.
Father and I had sailed into the Stone Town harbour and made our way to the guest house your parents always made available to us. I was probably 16 that year, and you were no more than 11 or 12. We had stayed there many times, but I had never seen any member of your family other than your father before. On this day, however, as we wearily strode down the cobbled walk, intent only on a quick meal and then rest, there were two young girls in the front yard. One of them was blonde with a laugh that reminded me of church bells, but it was the other, the one sitting primly on a bench, with a violin tucked close to her cheek, who captured my attention.
His gaze shifted to her face, and he traced one finger down her cheek.
She had beautiful tawny skin.
A tingle of desire rippled out from the place of his touch, such that it made its way deep into the depths of her and clenched her stomach tight. His focus angled to her hair. He wrapped one of her curls around his forefinger and caressed it with his thumb.
And long black curls that shimmered in the sunlight, till a lad's hands itched for the feel of them.
RyAnne chuckled in embarrassment at that. If only the man knew how she despised her curls all these years. His gaze returned to hers.
Even at that I might have just passed on by, but then you played the first note. It was as though the melody reached out and took me by the shoulders and said, "Stand still, lad, and pay attention."
His eyes crinkled at the corners, as if to admit he knew the sentiment was ridiculous. He lifted one hand and stroked his thumb down from her forehead to touch the outer corner of her eye.
I don't remember what song you were playing, but I remember the way you closed your eyes. And I remember how you swayed as you poured your whole heart into the melody.
He was once again blurred by her tears. She bit her lip to withhold the sob of sheer happiness welling up inside her. He shifted slightly.
I at first thought you were playing for your sister. But when the song ended, I realized that she was nowhere to be seen. It was from the gardener, tending the nearby rose bushes, that you sought your compliments.
RyAnne nodded, capturing the moisture beneath her lashes with her fingertips. His name was Samir, and he never once criticized my playing. I would mangle a song over and over again as I practiced out on the lawn, and I'm sure his poor ears rebelled many a time, but he always smiled. He would pat me on the head, tuck a rosebud into my hair, and tell me I played as though I were expressing the voice of the angels. Trent smiled gently and stroked the backs of his fingers across her jaw.
He spoke true.
He took a breath.
I think that was the day I fell in love with you.
RyAnne snorted and gave his chest a little shove. Go on with you. That's not true. You were ever treating me like a bossy big brother, and I should know. I had one. You made it too." He shook his head.
"I tried to act the big brother. I told myself that's who I was to you, but always there was more to it. You made me feel things. Make me feel things, RyAnne, that none other ever has before or since. Terror when I would find you gallivanting in some neglected corner of the island, helping one poor wretch or another, uncaring of the danger you constantly put yourself in. Sheer frustration when you wouldn't capitulate and do as I said. Jealousy when you prattled on incessantly about that fop Braden."
They both chuckled at that. He pulled one of her hands to rest it against his face, kissed the inside of her wrist, sniffed and blinked dampness from his eyes.
"I want to spend my days having the privilege of caressing your curls of a night, kissing your neck of a morning, listening to you pour your heart and soul out to the strings of your violin." He paused to clear his throat, and then he said, "RyAnne Hunter, will you marry me?"
She went down on her knees in order to be face to face with him. She breathed out, "With every beat of my heart." "Yes." He kissed her then, long and sure and slow, the silken caress of his lips against hers, inducing turmoil at the core of her being, like 1,000 sunbirds suddenly taking flight. And she gave of herself as she never had to another, offering her soul to him with every snatched breath, every nip of her teeth, every caress of her tongue. His hands settled about her waist, and he made a low sound of pleasure as he pulled her nearer. His lips left hers and trailed a hot path across her cheek, to her ear, to her neck, and then back to her lips. Her heart pounded till she could feel it knocking. She curled her fingers into his hair, relishing the soft feel of it against her palms. Between kisses she whispered, "I love you." He slowed their ardor then, dropping soft kisses against her lips, easing back, and then leaning in again to dole out a few more. Finally he pulled back, pressed his forehead to hers, and gripped her face between his palms, holding her back when she would have kissed him again. He shook his head with a self-depreciating smile.
"Woman, you can't kiss a man like that and expect him to be able to sleep at night."
She smiled softly and traced the corner of his mouth with one finger. "I believe, sire, that it was you who kissed me. I'm completely innocent." He laughed and leapt up, drawing her to her feet and tugging her toward the flap.
"I believe Keiko bagged a couple hairs. When I came in, June was showing the girls how to spit them over the fire. We should go eat."
RyAnne pulled him to a stop. "Are you trying to get out of letting me examine that shoulder?"
"My shoulder is very much better than your ankle at this point, I assure you. But come out into the light, where you will be able to see it better, and I will show you to allay your worry."
Out on the grass he paused and tugged the collar of his shirt to one side so she could see the wound. She did feel a great deal of relief after seeing it. It was nearly healed over completely, with no redness or swelling. She tugged his shirt back into place. "Thank you for alleviating my concerns." His lips ticked up at one corner, and he settled his hands at her waist.
"Perhaps I just wanted to get you this close."
The thrill of being in his arms swirled through her, but they were standing out in the open for all who were left in the camp to see now. She tilted him as stern a look as she could muster. "I believe dinner is served, Captain." She started off toward the fire. He fell in beside her, but leaned close to say,
"Indeed, and such deplorable timing, that."
Part 2. Jasmine was unsure how cholera had come to Stone Town, but come it had. There had only been a few cases at first, but then suddenly the disease had passed from one to another like flame to dry tinder. For several weeks she'd been helping Dr. Kirk night and day at the clinic, and now not only had it struck her town, but her family as well. She had just found Mother collapsed on the tiles in the entryway. With Mother's head in her lap, she gently patted her cheeks, willing her tears to remain at bay. Wasn't it enough that first her father had gone off to the continent to die, and then she'd been forced to watch the relatively quick but excruciating death of several of her students? Was God now asking her to witness the same in her mother? Mother, wake up, please. We need to get you to your room. I have not the strength to carry you up the stairs. Even she recognized the desperation in her tone. Mother didn't stir. Sarah! Jasmine rocked gently, pressing Mother's hair away from her damp face. Where had the maid gone? She'd been fast on Jasmine's heels when they'd walked into the entry and seen Mother, and now she was nowhere to be seen. With no other recourse, Jasmine turned to prayer. Oh, Father, please don't take her from us. Lusty birdsong slipped through the open front door. Jasmine frowned at the square of bright sunlight cast upon the tiles beside her. Had the door been open a moment ago?
Jasmine!
The call came from outside, and pounding footsteps drew the familiar voice of her brother nearer. Relief coursed through her, even as the fleeting question over what Rory was doing back in town flitted through her mind. She didn't know why he was here, but perhaps the good Lord had brought him. He burst through the open door and skidded to a stop by her side.
I just saw Sarah. She's gone on to fetch the doctor. What happened?
So that was where the maid had disappeared to. Thankfulness for her quick thinking filled Jasmine. She shook her head in answer to Rory's question. I just walked in and found her collapsed. My guess is cholera.
Cholera?
Despite his obvious shock, he bent to scoop Mother into his arms.
Here, let me get her. Where do you want me to take her?
Take her up to her bedroom. I'll go fetch hot tea. It seems to be something that helps some people recover from the sickness, but we have to spoon it into her every 10 minutes round the clock for the next several days. Jasmine bustled toward the kitchen, willing herself to keep her composure, and wishing that Garrett were here. Just his presence somehow had the ability to calm her. Trent awoke the next morning with a reminder that he still hadn't found any evidence of whom Khalifa might have been working with. His heart was heavy with the failure. Llewellyn and the Queen were counting on him to get the job done. The savannah trilled with its typical morning serenade of warbled birdsong and wind-swept grasses, interrupted by the occasional bark of a gazelle or the braying of a zebra. Already he could feel the oppressive heat that was slinking over the horizon to scorch everyone and everything with its hot, fetid breath. He sighed and sat up on the edge of his pallet and studied the side of the tent across the way. He had given the feather tick to RyAnne the evening before, but she had declared that she could not sleep on anything so befouled by Khalifa. More than once I witnessed him take women in there, and... Her words had cut off, and she had looked out toward the setting sun, its golden light glinting off the tears shimmering in her eyes. Fear threaded through him as surely as though a needle were drawing it. He stepped around to ensure he had a good look at her face.
Did he touch you?
Everything in him seemed to still as he waited for her answer. She gave a derisive snort and shook her head. The tears spilled over. No, never me, or any of the other women who were chained with me. We were worth more, you see. Self-derision hung in her tone. To get one of us with child would have cost him money, and he was ever about his profits. She looked at him then, with a world of hurt dulling the green of her eyes. I despise myself for being glad that I was deemed too costly to touch. He had pulled her into his arms, his soul quaking with thankfulness that she had been spared, and yet aching with her at all the evil she had been witness to. Trent's jaw bunched now as he shook out his boots to ensure no scorpions had taken refuge in them during the night, and then he tugged them on. The feather mattress had been given to Muyo and Niimbo, who had in turn insisted that June sleep on one end of such a luxurious anomaly of bedding. Trent had worked with Keiko and Asha to transport those who were wounded or too weak from sickness and malnutrition into the larger tent that had been Khalifa's. RyAnne had also wanted to give up Jabir's tent, but he had convinced her to take June, Muyo, and Niimbo into the shelter and stay with them. And he was glad she had capitulated, For he knew he would not have slept a wink had she insisted on sleeping under the stars last night. Sometimes one rogue lion followed another. Thankfully, there had been no incidents in the night hours. He rolled wearily to one side. Today his task would be to convince RyAnne that they should leave for Bagamoyo, post-haste. He knew she would want to stay and help care for the sick, but Keiko and June had confided in him the evening before that they would not be travelling farther with them. They had no desire to go anywhere near the fateful city called Lay Down Your Heart. They would stay here and care for the invalids, they had said. But he should take Miss RyAnne back to her people, where she would no longer be in danger, and that was the very thing he planned to convince her of today. After that, he would have to face his failure and decide how he was going to reveal the disappointment to Commodore Cornwall. Last night, before they had moved the captives into the tent, he had torn the place apart again, even going so far as to flip back the rug and check the ground beneath it. But the lantern light had revealed nothing out of place. No buried safety boxes, no parchment secured to the underside of the rug. Nothing. In disgust, he looked over at the 2 wooden drawers that he had lugged out and set by his pallet. He wasn't sure where he had decided to take them, but if nothing else, he could hand them over to Llewellyn, to show him they contained no proof of illegal activity, nor revealed whom Khalifa's contact on the island might be. And he would like to have the Arabic letters translated by a trustworthy source, just to be sure they contained nothing revealing. The morning sun spilled across the drawers, as though to mock him with his lack of evidence. But then something caught his eye. He sat up. There was a crack along the base of the top drawer that he hadn't noticed in the dim interior of the tent the evening before. At first glance, it could have been a seam in the wood, but it was in an odd place. Trent dragged the drawer closer and held it to the light to study it from all angles. The seam continued around the entire circumference of the bottom side of the drawer. It had a false bottom. He pressed on it from several angles, to no avail. Then he removed the drawer casing and peered inside the cavern left by its absence. There! A small round piece of bronze protruded from the front lip on the inside. He pressed it with one finger and heard a satisfying click. The bottom of the drawer tilted open. The inside was lined with thick felt and contained 4 things: a small ink pot, a sharpened quill, a small pouch filled with coins that would come in handy once they arrived in Bagamoyo and needed to book passage, and a scrap of red silk wrapped around a thin rectangular object at the back of the space. Trent tugged it free and unwrapped the silk, his heart rate matching the timpani of village drums in the distance. The silk fell away, to reveal a small, leather-bound journal. And Trent's brows shot up. The journal's cover was embossed with a golden insignia of Harcourt shipping. That in itself was not too surprising, since Khalifa was commodore of their fleet. But every page of the book was blank. So why had Khalifa kept it hidden in the secret compartment? One other thing struck him as odd. The same citrus scent he'd smelled upon the letters infused the pages of the journal. Perhaps it had seeped through the box, yet it seemed too strong for that to be the case. With a disheartened huff, he closed the book and ran one finger over the gilt foil ship on the front. Could Llewellyn have been right all along? Perhaps Khalifa was indeed working for Braden. But of course this was not proof. Khalifa could have any number of reasons for having a blank Harcourt logbook in his possession. If not for the fact that he'd found it concealed in the false bottom of the drawer, he likely would have passed it over as something of little consequence. Yet, how could a blank book be evidence of anything? The question remained, why had Khalifa kept it hidden? Trent gnawed on his lower lip for a moment before stuffing everything back into the compartment and clicking it closed again. He sighed and clambered to his feet, but now he needed to see what he could do about convincing his stubborn wife-to-be that they should head down the road while the morning was still relatively cool. They would need to stop through midday and find some shade on a day shaping up to be as hot as this one. He found her just emerging from Jabir's tent. Her dress was stained and torn, and it was quite obvious that her hair hadn't seen the use of a brush for quite some time. Yet his heart lurched in his chest at the joy of simply being near her, and her beauty shone through, even in these lowliest of circumstances. How had he garnered enough luck to have her agree to be his wife? He took her hands in his and leaned close to drop a quick kiss against her lips.
"And how are you this morning? Sleep well?"
She nodded. "I did. It's amazing how well one can sleep when they don't have an iron manacle clanking against a chain, or gouging into their ankle every time they move." Trent tucked his fingers into his armpits and plunged ahead with what he'd come to talk to her about.
"I've something to say, and I'm going to ask that you hear me out before you decline me."
She smiled. "If you are so sure of my answer, then why ask at all?"
"Because I hope that in this instance you will see sense and do as I ask."
She dipped her chin and gave him her signature look. "It's how you sell it, Captain." He grinned at that.
"Perhaps. But I'm a seaman, not a salesman."
Taking his hand, she tugged him toward the fire. "Well then, let us break our fast, and you can try to convince me to see things your way." He strolled with her to the fire, relishing the feel of her soft fingers intertwined with his. The fish traps Usher had hastily woven using grass and twigs the night before and set in the creek overnight must have done their job, because several fish roasted on the spit above the flames. He slipped one off and took half for himself and gave the other half to RyAnne. There were more loquats, too, and he put several of those on his plate while he decided the best way to sell the subject to her. When they had sat down together and blessed their food, he launched in,
"I know you probably want to stay here, to continue helping to tend the wounded. But as I told you just before you were captured, I've been under a commission from Commodore Cornwall to discover whether Khalifa was up to some illegal activities, and if so, to bring him proof of who the man worked for. Despite my lack of evidence here, I can't help but think that Khalifa would have ships waiting for his arrival in Bagamoyo, and perhaps I can learn something more from those captains or crews."
She opened her mouth to respond, but he wasn't done stating his case yet, so he held up one hand.
"Please, let me finish. I promised your father before he passed that I would care for you, and I'm begging you to make that job easier for me by agreeing to accompany me."
She leaned toward him.
"Captain," he barged ahead, "I can conclude my business for Llewellyn, and we can visit your family in Stonetown and have Bishop Tozer perform the wedding ceremony for us. Then, if you like, we can return. But for now—"
"Captain!" RyAnne laughed. Irritation furrowed his brow, but at the humor dancing in her eyes, he offered a begrudging,
"What?"
"I've been trying to tell you that we can leave as soon as you deem it necessary."
"We can?"
Humor lifted one corner of her mouth. "Indeed!" Relief eased through him.
"I see. I thought you would want to stay and help nurse the sick."
RyAnne glanced toward the newly christened sick tent, and an emotion he couldn't quite define crossed her features. "Papa trained June quite well in the weeks that she travelled with us and worked with us in the clinic at the village. I think she will do just as well as I can. Besides," when she didn't go on, he prompted.
"Yes?"
She flicked her hand as though to bat away a pesky idea. "I can't really say for sure, but I think, well," a hint of embarrassment crossed her face. "Do you think the Lord can speak to us, Captain? Really speak to us?" Trent tossed the bones of his fish into the fire and licked the grease from his fingers.
"I don't see why not. What is it you feel he is speaking to you?"
A leery foreboding gripped his middle. With RyAnne, one never knew what the next words out of her mouth might be. Life with this woman would certainly keep him in the thick of the dance. "That's just it. I'm not exactly sure. But ever since I walked the gangplank up to the Wasp at first dawn and saw the horrors of the harbour, I keep hearing a question." She pressed her lips together and met his gaze.
"And it is?"
"Whom shall I send, child?" Trent lifted his brows, his curiosity piqued.
"Send where?"
RyAnne shrugged. "I don't know. I first thought it might have meant I was to go to the village with Papa, which I did. But then, just a couple weeks back, I heard the question again." She laughed derisively. I thought I might be going crazy, because of course at that point I thought you were dead, and my future would be as a slave to some palace in the East. And I knew I would have no say in where I would go. But then you came and—" She waved her hand again. "I'm once more trying to discern what it means, and why God would want to use someone as lacking in faith as I." Trent reached over and squeezed her wrist.
Even the prophet Elijah struggled with faith at times. Did he not? Immediately after the victory over the prophets of Baal, where God proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was in control, Elijah feared for his life and ran from Queen Jezebel.
RyAnne pondered that. "I suppose he did." Trent nodded.
Our human frailty is no excuse for not following God's leading. I'm sure it will all become clear in time.
She sighed. "I suppose so."
For now, let's say our goodbyes and get on our way as quickly as possible. I'm still hoping to find some information in Bagamoyo about who Khalifa might have been working with.
He debated the merits of his next words, but decided it might be best to prepare her for the bad news now.
I have a strong suspicion he might have been working for Braden.
Her eyes widened and her jaw slacked. "What evidence have you?" His lips twisted into a grimace of frustration.
Not much, I admit.
He couldn't bring himself to tell her that it was only a blank logbook with the Harcourt shipping insignia that had given resurgence to his suspicions. RyAnne's chin tipped up, and her jaw took on that oh-so-familiar stubborn jut. "You must be mistaken. Braden could never do something as despicable as this." Trent might have known she would take up for young Harcourt, and he was man enough to admit to the sheer jealousy roiling through him, if only to himself. He stood.
I pray you are right. Be ready to go within the hour?
She nodded. And with that he walked away and left her there, hopefully to adjust to the idea that her former beau
might be the one behind her kidnapping.
RyAnne watched Trent stride away, her eyes narrowing with each step he took, until they finally fell closed with dread and exasperation. What if he was right? Could Braden really be responsible for all of this? On the other hand, could the captain simply be jealous of her past association with Braden and trying to pin this on him? She shook her head. If there was one thing she knew about Trent, it was that he'd never do something like that. She sighed and stood to her feet. She had better get on with her goodbyes. She had nothing to pack, of course, so his hour-long deadline would be easily met. She searched out June, who was in the loquat grove. June stood on the ground catching the clusters of fruit that Moyo and Niimbo, who were aloft in the trees, tossed to her. It looked like they were scavenging the last of the fruits to feed to the sick with the noon meal. "June?" Emotion clogged her throat. Instead of facing her task, she asked instead, "What will you do to supplement meals when this grove is picked clean?" June caught another cluster, lobbed by Niimbo, and then called to the girls that they had enough for now. Lifting the basket and tucking it against her hip, she faced RyAnne. "There are enough loquats here for 2 more days. Most should be rested and much recovered by that time. Only half a day's journey from here we pass the guava grove. Keiko plans for us to travel there and rest again, if all are not well enough to keep travelling." She dipped her knees and offered a shy smile. "Captain Dawson has assured us that the God we now serve will provide for us." RyAnne smiled and clutched her hand. "He will indeed. You've been a good friend to me these past months, June. I've come to say my goodbyes. The captain and I must be off within the hour." She pulled the startled woman into an embrace, basket of fruit and all. June laughed nervously.
"Go well, my lady."
She turned then and called the girls to come and say farewell. RyAnne had thought she might escape without shedding any tears. But when Moyo wrapped her skinny little arms around RyAnne's waist and squeezed with all her might, her vision blurred before she could take command of herself. She embraced the girl in return, holding her in silence for a long moment, because she had no words to express all that she was feeling. Finally, she set Moyo back and knelt before her. She took the little shoulders into her hands and ensured she had Moyo's attention before she spoke. "You are very special and precious to God, Moyo. Never let the actions of anyone, future or past, make you doubt that." "I?" Moyo nodded. Hanimbo. RyAnne tugged the other little girl close. You were spared for a reason. You and Moyo will be sisters now. And you must help each other remember to serve the one true God. Yes? Niimbo nodded, her eyes sparkling. Captain Dawson told me many stories from God's book. I will tell them to Moyo. That's good. Very good. Come here. She pulled both the girls against her, one in each arm. She revelled for a moment in the feel of precious little ones tucked close, and then she kissed their cheeks. I must be off. And with that she left them there quickly, before she might change her mind and refuse to return to Zanzibar with Captain Dawson. She found Yoni next. The poor woman looked listless. RyAnne had no word of comfort for a woman whose child had been taken from her in such a senseless way. So she simply pulled her in tight for a long moment. She was ready and waiting when Trent and Usher found her not too long later. The captain was pushing a two-wheeled cart. The rickety cart looked like it might cause more trouble than it was worth. Trent took one look at her and tipped his head to urge her to fall into step beside him. Let us be on our way, before the emotions I see swimming so close to your surface cause you to change your mind. He smiled softly, even if he didn't stop walking. With a sigh and a bit of grouse that he seemed to know her so well, she hoisted her violin and her skirts and strode out in his wake. The savannah grasses were thin here, and it gave her no comfort to realize that so many slaves had passed this way that a veritable trail had been worn into the plains. The cart Trent pushed was covered with what was left of the sheet he had used to wrap her ankle the evening before. She reached out and tugged at one corner to see what the bulges beneath it were. 2 wooden drawers with locks in the front face sat to one side. The rest of the cart had been stacked with a few ivory tusks. She dropped the corner of the sheet, her lips thinning at the sight of the ivory. She glowered at the man beside her. Trent swiped a trickle of sweat from his temple with his shoulder, and didn't even pause his trek down the path. Lest you forget, my intentions when coming to the interior were never to get rich on ivory, as I first told you. So don't look at me as though I were something to be scraped from the bottom of your little boots. We are going to need the money I'll get from selling this ivory to reserve passage aboard a ship for Zanzibar. RyAnne only sighed as she settled her violin into one corner of the cart. It took them 2 days to reach the port town of Bagamoyo, and RyAnne's revulsion as she walked the streets of the city was just as great, if not greater, than it had been the first time she'd been exposed to Bagamoyo from the deck of the Wasp in the harbour. Trent led the way down a dusty street. Usher, bringing up the rear, pushed the rickety cart that had somehow miraculously made it this far. Row upon row of chained captives slumped against buildings on either side, awaiting their fate with vacant stares and glum expressions. The sun baked down with merciless heat, yet none of the captives had any water. RyAnne's steps faltered, slowed, stilled. Captain, surely there is something we can do? A well sat in the middle of the next intersection. She lifted her skirts and started toward it, but Trent took her elbow and urged her down a side street in the direction of the harbour. We can't just leave them! She tugged away from him and started to go back, only to find Usher, arms folded, blocking her path. Trent sighed. RyAnne, there are slaves there who would not hesitate to attack you and use you as a hostage to try and negotiate their freedom. RyAnne felt tears sting her eyes. But surely there are many more who would be appreciative of just a drink of water. Trent crossed his arms and kicked at the dust for a moment. He looked up and studied her face, then reached out to cup her cheek and thumb away a tear that slipped loose. Aye, and well I know how your soft heart leads you into danger, time and again. Usher spoke up from behind her. Water will be given to them at noon. When she glanced back at him, still unsure whether she could walk away without at least trying to offer some help, he gestured to the sun, hanging just below its zenith. It would be noon within the next quarter of an hour. You're certain? Usher nodded. Many times I've walked the city with Khalifa. Always, water is given at noon. Trent took her hand and urged her to follow him. Let us find a room, and then I will go to the docks to see if I can book us passage for Stonetown. and see if he can't find more evidence to convict Braden of slave smuggling. The thought washed a wave of despair through RyAnne. The world was a bad enough place without finding out that your childhood friends might be slave runners. Reluctantly, she gave in and let him pull her down the alley. Usher took up pushing the cart behind them. They had only gone about a few blocks when Trent came to a stop. RyAnne glanced up and realized they stood before an Arabic bookshop. Trent strode to the cart and opened one of the 2 drawers. He withdrew several missives, all of a similar size, and motioned with them toward the interior of the shop.
Care to join me?
Usher folded his arms and stoically stood guard over the cart. RyAnne, anxious for her first glimpse of civility in months, hurried to follow Trent inside. A hunched elderly man, with round spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and a white kufi upon his head, smiled from behind the counter. Trent touched his forehead in greeting.
Unazungumza Kiswahili?
The man nodded, that he did indeed speak Swahili, and then his smile broadened.
But I also speak English, my friend.
Trent chuckled.
Then I'm doubly blessed to have stumbled upon your shop.
He laid the packet of letters on the counter.
I wonder if you have a moment to read a few letters?
The shopkeeper tugged his spectacles up to his eyes and nodded. Trent pulled one of the pages from its envelope and slid it across the counter.
Can you read that language?
RyAnne felt a tingle of anticipation rush through her. If Khalifa had been hiding information in plain sight, the next few minutes might reveal it to them. The old man's eyes lit up.
Yes, yes.
Trent and RyAnne looked at each other exultantly. Wizened hands drew the paper closer, and RyAnne held her breath. After only a moment, the old man set the letter back on the counter. He tugged his spectacles free and polished them with a cloth.
This letter is written to a man named Ali, yes?
Trent nodded. RyAnne stepped closer, not wanting to miss a word of what was about to be said. The shopkeeper tapped the missive.
This is from his wife, back in Oman. She writes of their 2 daughters, and Ali's,
he paused for a quick chuckle,
wretched mother, who apparently lives with them in Oman.
RyAnne glanced at Trent, her shoulders slumping. There didn't seem to be any hidden information in that, did there? Trent, too, looked disappointed. He handed the other letters to the man, who read each one to them, word for word. All were similar correspondence from Khalifa's wife, and none contained anything important. Trent scrubbed one hand over his face, thanked the man, and paid him the few coins he requested. Back out at the cart, Trent thrust the envelopes into the top box, and they continued on their way in silence. RyAnne angled a look upward. Have you seen our suffering, Father? Where is the justice? Silence was her only answer. RyAnne sighed, and yet, wasn't that partly what faith was about? Trusting that God was good and his word was true, even when things didn't turn out exactly as hoped for? Just before the wharf, Trent parked the cart outside an alehouse. The Sanskrit and English sign above the door read, Rooms for Let. Trent paid a lad a few coins to guard the cart, and then he hoisted the 2 wooden drawers to his hip and handed RyAnne her violin. He led the way inside. Near a set of stairs off to the left, 2 turbaned men played a sitar and a tempura. The room was dim and hardly appeared like a place to frequent. However, many tables were full, and the luscious scents emanating from the kitchen made RyAnne's stomach grumble embarrassingly. The proprietress, a stooped old woman with only one front tooth, who was barely visible above the back counter, informed them that she only had 1 room left for the evening.
We'll take it,
Trent said.
Please send up water for a bath.
He held out the required payment. The woman snatched the shillings from Trent's outstretched fingers and then tipped her head toward the north.
Baths to house that way. Big sign.
It would be a public bathhouse then, and now that she was in the sheltered interior away from the grit and noise and anguishing sights of the city, RyAnne had no desire to go back out again. Besides, she'd gone for weeks on end without so much as warm water to wash with, so any water at all would be a luxury. Just a bucket of warm water will do. Can we at least have that? She offered the old woman a pleading smile. The woman sniffed, but snapped her fingers at a girl hovering in the shadows just behind her. The girl scrambled off to presumably fetch a bucket of warm water. Trent gave Usher the bag of coins.
Get us some food?
Usher sank down at one of the empty tables in the corner of the room. Trent then touched a hand to RyAnne's lower back and nudged her up the stairs.
I'll bring you up a plate. I'm sure you are exhausted and would like to rest.
RyAnne's heart dropped. She was exhausted, but the truth was she'd only just gotten used to having the captain around again, and the thought of being without him, even for a little while, filled her with trepidation. "You aren't going to leave me, are you?" The moment the words left her mouth, her face heated. She didn't want to turn into a clingy woman who never wanted to let her man out of her sights. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't. I'll be fine. It's just that I've only just gotten you back, and—" Trent stepped through the door to her room and set the 2 drawers on a table. He took her violin and laid it next to them. Then, stepping back into the entry, he settled both hands on her shoulders and bent to meet her gaze.
I won't be far. I need you to promise me you'll stay in the room. I have to head to the docks and see if I can get a good price for that ivory and book us passage to Stonetown. But I'll return just as quickly as I can. And tonight I'll sleep right here.
He tapped one toe on the stone tiles beneath their feet.
Just outside your door.
RyAnne wrapped her hands around his forearms. "Hurry back, and please be careful." He pressed his forehead to hers.
Khalifa is gone. There's no need to worry about me. I'll be fine. I promise you.
Reluctantly, RyAnne let him go. Hot water came, and she washed. Her ankle was much improved with the constant cleaning she'd been giving it, for which she was thankful. A plate of curry and rice arrived, and she devoured it, not recalling the last time she'd eaten something so delicious. And then she waited.
Part 3.
Garrett took the stairs to the upper floor of the Hunters' home 2 at a time. Jasmine would be up in her mother's room, just as she had been the past several times he'd visited. Each of those times he tried to coax her into resting herself, but she'd insisted that her mother's recovery was too delicate to leave in the hands of someone else. She'd been sleeping in 10-minute snatches for the last 2 days. This time he was going to insist that she let the maid, Sarah, handle some of the care, so Jasmine could get some proper sleep herself. Provided her mother was still fighting, he prayed she would pull through. Jasmine's tender heart could not take another loss. He knocked softly on the door.
Jazz?
A flurry of soft footsteps gave him a picture of her running on tiptoe to the door, and then it opened. Her eyes were bright and filled with a joy that gave him immediate relief.
Is she better then?
She nodded, excitement fairly vibrating from every pore in her body. "She's finally able to hold down some broth, and kept a whole cup of tea down for the last 20 minutes.
Heaven be praised.
He could see the utter weariness clinging to her beneath the excitement. She glanced over her shoulder to where her mother slept on the bed. Yes, indeed. Garrett reached out and took her hand. She swung back to face him.
I hope you'll allow me to convince you to get some rest of your own now.
She tilted her head as though considering that for the first time since her mother had improved. Yes, she responded slowly. I think I might. Even as she said the words, a large yawn stretched her jaw. She flushed. Forgive me. I'll just get Rory to take a turn watching her. We must keep fluids. Garrett lifted a hand to interrupt her, his relief over her agreement making him hasty.
I'll get Rory after I escort you to your room. And I promise to instruct him to keep giving your mother fluids every
30 minutes should be sufficient, now that she's on her way to recovery. Garrett nodded.
I'll tell him.
He stepped back so that she could leave if she was ready.
Is there anything you need to retrieve?
He motioned behind her into the room. She lifted her skirts and stepped past him. No, thank you. She started down the hall with another yawn, but stumbled a bit and paused to lean one hand against the wall. Garrett didn't hesitate.
You've exhausted yourself beyond your strength.
He scooped her into his arms. Jasmine didn't even fight him. She nestled her head against his shoulder and mumbled, I believe I have. She was asleep before he'd taken more than 3 steps toward her room. Trent easily found a vendor near the docks who paid him top price for the ivory. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to find upon reaching the harbour, but certainly seeing Braden Harcourt's indigo fields floating placidly in the bay had not been on his list of possibilities. What were the odds that a Harcourt ship would happen to be in this harbour at the exact time Khalifa was set to arrive? Braden Harcourt's ship. Trent snorted. Could Braden truly be so arrogant as to be here himself? He glanced over at Usher. Did you ever see the man Khalifa worked for? Usher leaned into his heels and folded his arms dispassionately.
2 times each year for the past 3 years.
Trent spun to face the man fully.
I say, what?
Surely he hadn't heard correctly. Could his answers really be that simple?
Hair the colour of savannah grass. Eyes the colour of the cloudless sky. The very picture of Braden.
Trent tapped a fist to his lips. He had to think.
Would he recognise you, do you think, this man?
Usher shrugged.
To most Anglos, one native looks much like another.
That was true enough and could work in his favour.
Usher, you understand that freedom is yours, correct? So nothing I ask of you is required.
Usher gave a curt nod.
Very well. Then we wait. He will come, Usher asserted. Always he comes near 2 hours before the setting of the sun.
Trent glanced at the sun. It was still early afternoon, so they were in for a long wait then. He scrubbed his hands over his face and sauntered to a slab bench against the shake siding of an alehouse. The deep canvas awning overhead would ensure that, come late afternoon, he and Usher would be cloaked in shadows. As they settled in to wait, Trent willed away the trembling in his limbs. Why did he suddenly feel as though he had stepped onto a thin ledge that jutted out over a canyon with hundreds of hungry lions below? He'd been more than disappointed to learn that Khalifa's letters really were nothing more than communications from back home. But the answers he'd been hunting could be within his grasp by this evening. In that same amount of time, things could also turn terribly wrong. A metallic tingle spread across his tongue. Things had definitely been going more wrong than right lately. RyAnne paced the small room, hating being separated from the captain only days after their reunion. And it was stifling. Sweat trickled in a rivulet down her back, and her neck was damp and sticky. She paused at the built-in window bench, hoping for a breeze, or at least something beautiful to look at. But the only view was of the stone wall of the next building across the back alley, and despite the fact that her window was pushed wide open, no breeze even stirred the gauzy drapes. RyAnne fanned her face with her hand, trying to be grateful as she recalled that only a few days ago she had been chained to several other women and bound for slavery. She oughtn't be so disgruntled. Flapping her hand only made her hotter, so she gave up and glanced around the room, hoping for something to use as a fan. Her search landed on the 2 wooden drawers. Quickly, she crossed the room and opened the first drawer. RyAnne hastily extracted one of the envelopes and put it to use. Her eyes dropped closed in satisfaction at the first few puffs of stirred air that cooled her neck. She moseyed back to the window again. If she couldn't see anything, she might at least be able to hear the sounds of the city. She sank onto the pillowed window seat, and since there were no windows in the building across the way, audaciously propped her feet against the casement on the other side and pulled her skirts up nearly to her knees. Sweet relief! Mother would flay her for such unladylike conduct were she here. But the Bagamoyo was even hotter than RyAnne ever remembered Stonetown being. She sat fanning for a long time, and then as she cooled, the soft lull of gull song and the plush comfort of the pillows at her back lured her into a hazy world, halfway between wake and sleep. She settled the envelope onto the cushion at her side, snuggled deeper into the soft seat, and gave in to the luxury of a nap. When she woke, she could not have said how long she had slept, but it had been long enough that the sun had sought out her resting place, and she was once again dripping with perspiration. Tongue thick with thirst, she rolled from the cushion and patted her way over to the pitcher and glass on the table near the door. She downed a full glass of water and another half before her thirst was quenched. Drizzling some of what remained in the cup onto one hand, she then set the cup down, rubbed both hands together, and then patted the water droplets across her face and neck. She doused her arms next, stopping herself short of soaking her entire head with the water that remained in the pitcher. Now, to get a breeze working with the water, she moved back to the window seat and took up the envelope to once again fan herself. The air moving against her damp skin felt like a little bit of heaven. Something caught her eye. She paused for a moment and frowned at the envelope. There was a round brown dot just to the right of the address that she would have sworn wasn't there when she first took the envelope from the box. She examined the seat cushion to see if something had been spilled on it that could have transferred to the envelope. The captain likely wouldn't take kindly to her getting anything on any of them before he could turn them over to Commodore Cornwall. Nothing sticky or damp seemed to be on the cushion. Frowning, she studied the envelope again, turning it this way and that. There was certainly a spill of some sort there. She slipped one finger under the flap and withdrew the paper from within to examine the inside of the envelope. The stain was visible there, but not as distinctly, and yet several blotches seemed to have transferred to the pages of the letter it contained. Oh, dash it all! How do I seem to do these things? She strode over to the window seat again and smoothed open the letter in the sunlight so that she might get a good look at the damage she'd somehow done. The letter was written in a delicate hand on a fine creamy parchment. The black, carefully scripted Arabic was intricately penned and so straight as to perhaps have been written with a ruler, but it was in each space above and below the lines of black lettering that the damage seemed to have been done. Something made her still, and she held the letter away from her, studying it more carefully. The brown blotches were just as neatly lined up as the black ink. She glanced at the sunlight beating down on the cushion where she'd napped, and then back to the paper in her hands. The paper had rested in the direct sun for probably quite some time before the sun had sunk far enough to reach her and wake her with its heat. The hand holding the letter trembled, and she could feel her heart thumping against her breastbone. There was hidden writing on the parchment. It wasn't clear enough to make out yet, but with a little more heat carefully applied. Her gaze flew to the two wooden drawers on the desk across the room. She had to tell Trent about this, now. There could be information written here that he needed to know. Quickly closing the window, she laid the two sheets of paper from the letter into patches of sunlight. With any luck, by the time they returned to the room, the heat would have done its work to reveal the hidden text on the pages. With that, she lifted her skirts, carefully locked the door of her room, dropped the key into her reticule, and then hastened down the stairs and out onto the street. Trent and Usher had been headed to the docks. She would start her search there. Just as Usher had predicted, a longboat lowered from the side of the Harcourt ship as the sun dropped into the 4 o'clock hour. The ship was too far out, and the day too drained of light to identify the people who descended the ladder and set to rowing toward the shore. But Trent felt a curl of anticipation even so. He stepped over to a market vendor selling contrives and purchased two, quickly wrapping one around his head in the fashion of many of the vendors and traders already walking the street near the harbour. He returned to his position on the bench under the awning. He thrust the second contrive at Usher. There was no point in tempting fate. Unlikely as it was, Harcourt just might recognize him. While Usher wrapped the headscarf around his face, Trent pondered. If only he had more proof. Even if they came ashore and upon discovering that Khalifa was not here, purchased a shipload of slaves, he needed more than the simple purchase of slaves to convict him. Since he had no written proof, he would have to catch them sailing slaves beyond the island of Zanzibar. He shrank farther into the shadows cast by the awning and continued to watch as the longboat drew nearer. Too bad Braden knew him, otherwise he could pose as a slave trader and try to trap him into agreeing to sail the cargo to Shanghai. But that particular option was out, considering he'd known the Harcourts for almost his entire life. The longboat tied up at the dock, and the men climbed out. When Harcourt turned toward them and started down the pier, Trent felt everything inside him tighten up. The man walking toward them was indeed a Harcourt, but it wasn't Braden, as Trent had supposed, but his father, William. Could the corruption run all the way through the family? How much did Braden truly know about his family business? Trent clamped his teeth together in irritation. He didn't like to be wrong, and he'd been so certain that it would be Braden he would find here, so certain that Braden was working with Khalifa quietly and right beneath his father's nose. But now, obviously, he had to rethink that assumption. Harcourt stepped past him and headed into the heart of the city. But Trent needed to be cautious. Despite his head covering, Harcourt had known him for years, and would recognize him in only a moment's time should his gaze land upon him. Trent thumped Usher on one shoulder.
Follow him. I need a full report of his actions. I'm returning to the inn and Miss Hunter.
Usher nodded and faded into the wharf crowd. Trent waited a moment more before heading down the alley to take the way back to the inn. RyAnne hustled toward the wharf with her skirts lifted to aid her speed. The answers Trent had been investigating for months might at this very moment be revealing themselves on the parchment back in her room. Her heart pounded at the mere thought. When she and the captain returned to the inn, she would ask the old woman at the front desk for a flat iron, and she and Trent would work together to reveal the dark secrets that Khalifa had been hiding. She skirted around a hawker selling dried fish, and then angled the other way to avoid a woman who thrust fresh fruit into her face, with the demand that she buy. "No, thank you. Not right now." An old man with a white-faced monkey on his shoulder ambled along in front of her. The walk was too narrow and crowded with wares here for her to get around him. His arthritic shuffle filled her with frustration. She walked on her tiptoes, trying to see if she could spot Trent ahead somewhere. Nothing. The black monkey clambered atop the old man's turban and studied her with a curious tilt to its white head. Its white-tipped tail curled around its feet, and it stretched its lips wide in a grin that only served to heighten RyAnne's impatience. An opening between vendors' carts finally presented itself, and RyAnne made haste to dart around man and monkey. The colobus reached out and swatted at her hair as she went past. RyAnne ducked away and gave the little beast a glower that made the toothless old man chuckle. When she reached the street in front of the wharf, she paused and looked both directions. Where exactly would the captain have gone? She shaded her eyes. She didn't see him to the south. She swung around and stepped out of the path of a trundling cart to look the other way.
I beg your pardon, lady.
A British man walking down the street almost barreled into her. He tugged on the brim of his hat and grumbled in a tone that indicated he would much prefer she simply remove herself from his presence. What she could see of the lower half of his face was set in stone, and he looked none too happy to be here in Bagamoyo. "I'm sorry." The man dropped his hand back to his side and lifted his gaze to hers. RyAnne's mouth fell open. "Mr. Harcourt, sir! What a pleasant surprise, this!" He'd been set to move past her, but upon hearing her use of his name, or perhaps it was on seeing her, he jolted to a stop. He scanned her up and down, blinking rather dazedly for a moment, and if she wasn't mistaken, his face paled a few shades. He gave a quick assessment of the street, both up and down, and then stepped back and took a moment to look at her again.
Miss Hunter! What a surprise to see you here.
RyAnne blushed as she remembered the state of her dress. She must present quite a shocking appearance, judging by his expression, and yet she couldn't help the grin that stretched her face from ear to ear. She reached out her arms and pulled him down to kiss both his cheeks. This was perfect. "Oh, it's really rather fortuitous, me bumping into you like this. Providence, really. Is Braden with you?"
He hesitated briefly. Not here, no, lass.
"Well," RyAnne waved away that line of the conversation, "that's not really important. But, you see, the captain and I have need of a ship to sail us to Zanzibar. The captain is here at the wharf, in point of fact. I was just looking for him. I don't suppose we could prevail upon you to give us a lift?" William Harcourt's brow bunched.
"The captain?"
he asked. "Captain Trent Dawson. I'm sure you remember him. He and his father have sailed in and out of Stone Town since I was just a girl in braids."
"Indeed, I remember."
He dragged out the words and once again searched the area, and there was something in his expression that made a chill seep down her spine. She suddenly remembered Trent's suspicions of Braden. But Braden wasn't here. His father was. And Mr. Harcourt was acting quite strangely, fidgety and testy, not at all like the man whom she'd thought of more like an uncle all her growing-up years. He'd seemed surprised to see her, yes, but not in a joyous way that someone might feel upon meeting an old acquaintance in the street. It was in a different sort of way that she couldn't quite place her finger on. She thought of Khalifa's letters, and she remembered that routinely Khalifa had sent runners off on errands while they'd been marching across the plains. Had he sent communications to his partners? If so, what information had he included? Could he have informed them that he had captured one Miss RyAnne Hunter, and that her lineage wasn't quite as impeccable as everyone back on the island thought? RyAnne suddenly felt a great need to put as much distance between herself and William Harcourt as possible. She lifted her skirts and stepped back. "Well, it's been lovely to see you again. I'll just continue on and find the captain, and then perhaps you and he can negotiate a passage back home." The truth was, she suddenly felt sure that the last ships they would seek passage aboard would be Harcourt ships. A smile bloomed on William's face, as though he wanted to put her at ease, but it had quite the opposite effect. "Nonsense!" He moved closer, and she had the distinct impression that were she to try and dart away, he would have her arm in his grasp before she even took 2 steps. His smile widened, if that was possible. "I'll come with you. Heading this way, were you?" He put one hand to her back and snapped his fingers at the men who accompanied him. They fell into step behind them. RyAnne swallowed. Her apprehension was foolish, wasn't it? She'd known William Harcourt for even longer than she'd known the captain, after all. Yet she couldn't shake off the remembrance of the stationery baking in the sun back at the inn. She pulled in a steadying breath. Be calm. He might have a perfectly legitimate reason for being here. "So what brings you to Bagamoyo, Mr. Harcourt?" William flapped a hand as if to make light of his reasons for being in a thriving slave entrepot. "Business. Just business. I'm meeting an associate of mine, but I fear he is late to arrive. I was just going to look for him, but it will wait. I couldn't live with myself if I left you wandering the harbour alone, and something happened to you. Your father, God rest him, would never forgive me." Another chill rippled down RyAnne's back, this one so strong that it stopped her in her tracks. Her hands tightened around fistfuls of her skirts. She hoped the voluminous material would hide her trembling. "How did you know? About Papa?" William turned to face her. He lifted a hand to rub the back of his neck. "Forgive me. I assumed. He was very unwell the last time I saw him, and you mentioned you were here with the captain, but said nothing of your father." A little relief swept in at that. His explanation was quite logical. Perhaps she was seeing shadows in a field of sunshine. Her hands loosed their hold. "Yes, well, you are correct. Papa has passed on. The captain is escorting me back home to bring the news to my family." She realised then that they had walked nearly the full length of the street and were almost to the water. "Ah, look at me. I've been talking so much that I must have passed the captain right by." She started to turn back. A black cloth fell over her head, and a firm hand clamped over her mouth. Terror washed through her as she kicked and clawed to fight her way free, all to no avail. A painful blow to the side of her head stunned her to stillness. "Hurry! Get her on the ship!" Mr. Harcourt's voice. She felt sticky warm blood seeping through her hair. 2 men lifted her, and with the hand clamped over her mouth, making breathing difficult, it was taking all her concentration just to find her next breath. "How did she even escape from him?" "I know not, Captain," Harcourt cursed. "My cargo better be intact." There was a thump and a clatter, and then she landed in a puddle of rank water, likely in the bottom of a rowboat. A boot pressed into her chest, keeping her pinned down, and the sound of oars dipping into the waves left her weakened by hopelessness. Praying that Usher would not come back to him empty of helpful information, Trent wearily climbed the stairs to RyAnne's room at the inn. He rolled his shoulder in a circular motion, trying to work out some of the knots that had built up in it. His body begged for a few hours of sleep, but he didn't have time to rest, nor would he be able to with Harcourt roaming the streets. He leaned his shoulder into the wall next to RyAnne's door and knocked softly in case she might be sleeping. When there was no answer, he tried again, just a little louder. Still, she did not come to the door. An eerie foreboding filled him. Should he burst in to make sure she was all right? And if he did, and she was simply sleeping soundly, he didn't want to disturb her, especially when he didn't have much of an update to give her. He was still deliberating over what to do when pounding footsteps drew his gaze to the stairs. Usher burst into sight. "Miss Hunter!" Usher was panting so hard he could not get any other words past his throat, but he was gesturing wildly to RyAnne's door and then toward the wharf. A sick feeling wrapped a fist around Trent's stomach as he scrambled back from the door and prepared to breach it. Usher bent double, hands propped on his knees, but he waved toward RyAnne's door again, his eyes wide. "Captured!" She can't have. But his concerns had just been validated.
Dear Father above, when was the woman going to learn to consider her own safety?
His chest constricted till the beat of his heart thumped against his rib cage. Uncaring of the damage he would do, Trent slammed his boot into the door. Splinters flew as the old wood gave way to his assault, but he was left gasping in pain and holding his shoulder. The impact had vibrated through him and found his weakness. Quickly he assessed the room, his frail hopes flagging. Empty, just as he'd feared.
"Talk, Usher! What happened?"
Usher swept a hand down his face.
"I followed this Harcourt, just as you asked."
He paused to gulp another couple of breaths. And it was all Trent could do not to step forward and pummel the man for more information.
"And, in the street, there was Miss Hunter."
He made a gesture, like she had just suddenly appeared from thin air.
"They spoke, but I was too far away to hear these words. Then Miss Hunter seemed to try and leave him. But he walked with her. They walked to the wharf, and then—"
He lowered his eyes.
"They thrust a gunny sack over her and took her to Harcourt's ship."
Trent lost the strength to stand and sank onto the window seat cushion.
"Did the ship sail?"
Usher shook his head firmly.
"No. The men left the ship again and came ashore. I have a boy following them. He is to meet me here as soon as they start back to the wharf."
Trent dabbed at his forehead. It was hot as blazes in here, and he needed to think. He stood and turned to open the window behind him. His gaze landed on the paper even as he twisted open the latch and shoved the casement open. RyAnne must have been looking at Khalifa's letters.
But what was this?
He picked up the parchment and bent closer. His breath started to come in earnest then, for clearly revealed between the womanly black scrawl were words written in Swahili, a language he very much understood. The more he read, the faster his breaths came. Never taking his eyes off the paper, he spoke.
"Usher, light the lantern. Much light still comes through the window. Just do it, please."
Trent strode across the room to fetch the 2 wooden drawers that contained Khalifa's correspondence.
"You're sure that the ship has not sailed?" "Yes. And they didn't look like they were leaving soon. Harcourt still walked deeper into the city when I came here, and the boy is to come to me here as soon as they start back to the harbour."
Trent realized Usher had already said as much and eased out a breath. The ship wouldn't sail without its captain. He had a few minutes then to see what the rest of these letters contained. Pray to God all the letters in the drawer contained as much information as the one in his hand. For it seemed that Khalifa hadn't trusted the people he was working with and had kept detailed information about all their interactions, and quite cleverly, he'd put it down onto correspondence that wouldn't be suspicious for him to keep in his possession at all times. Perhaps he had written it down as a means for blackmail later down the road? Would it be enough proof for a court, though? Usher was still frowning in puzzlement, but he had lit the lantern, and the moment Trent held a new letter above the chimney and the brown letters of the hidden words began to appear, he gasped in amazement. Parchment after parchment detailed the plans and how they were smuggling the slaves beyond the island of Zanzibar from a series of underground caves on the north end of the island. This was exactly the kind of information that Cornwall needed. It was also the exact kind of evidence he might be able to trade for RyAnne's freedom. His heart constricted at the dilemma. And yet, he glanced back toward the wooden boxes. Perhaps. He took up the blank logbook and carefully held the first page over the heat from the lamp. Just as he'd suspected, the blank logbook was not blank at all, and the information it contained was precisely the kind of proof a court would need. It revealed a list of Khalifa's contacts off the island, merchants, if such men deserve such a benign term, living in India and the Far East, and then finally the last lines contained the names of Khalifa's partners on the island. Trent whistled low at the number of names on the list and their various positions on Zanzibar. But of course they would have needed men in their pay who could look the other way at key moments. Trent scanned the names again. The name Harcourt was there right at the top of the first column, and with a line beneath it. But it only appeared once, and with no other initials or names to indicate if the whole family was involved or just the head. Could Braden be totally innocent of his father's operations? Trent closed the logbook. He quickly gathered Khalifa's letters from his wife and folded them together, then thrust them and the logbook into RyAnne's violin case. He sank down at the writing desk and quickly opened the secret compartment at the base of Khalifa's wooden box and withdrew the small bottle of ink. He sniffed it and was satisfied to detect the distinct citrus scent he'd expected. Taking up the quill and several of the blank sheets of Khalifa's Harcourt letterhead, he set to hastily scrawling words across the pages. When he finished the first one, he pushed it toward Usher. "Heat that!" He scrawled information on several more sheets, having Usher heat the pages as they went. For the ruse to work, there should be more pages, but he was out of time. Hastily gathering up his handiwork, he tucked the newly minted letters into the wooden drawers. These he put into a haversack, which he slung over his shoulder. He shoved RyAnne's violin against Usher's chest. "Let's go and save Miss Hunter, and put a stop to a slave smuggling ring. Shall we?" When they arrived at the harbour, Trent was relieved to see that indeed Harcourt's ship still remained in the bay. He realized he'd halfway been afraid Usher might be wrong about that. His plan was really quite simple. William Harcourt was about to experience a mutiny on his ship. Trent's only concern was whether he and Usher could pull it off, just the two of them. He was thankful for the guns he'd taken off Khalifa. He checked the rounds on the revolver and then held it out to Usher. "Can you shoot?" Usher gave a single dip of his chin, flipped open the cylinder to check the rounds for himself, and then slammed it home again. His face was set, and he gave Trent another brief nod. Good. The man at least looked like he was telling the truth. Trent turned to double-check his rifle and tuck extra ammunition into his pocket. There was a lad with a rowboat waiting for a fare at the end of the dock. Trent slung his haversack aboard and climbed in after it. Usher sank down on the seat just behind Trent, propping RyAnne's violin across his knees. Trent motioned to the boy. "To the indigo fields there." The boy didn't move. "1 shilling." Despite his tension, Trent grinned at the lad's savvy. He reached in his pocket and pulled out the required payment, handing it over. The boy nodded and dug his oars into the water without so much as a word after that. Trent turned on his seat to face Usher. "The crew will be light at this time, because many will be on shore enjoying some leave." He tipped his head toward the indigo fields. "A ship this size, I'm guessing there will be 5 men on board at the most. We take them, and the rest will be easy to take as they come aboard." Usher nodded. "I am not afraid." Trent held out his palm for a handshake. "Glad to have you with me, friend." The rowboat bumped up against the side of the ship then, and a sailor peered over the side at them. "You lot, what you want?" Trent stood and smiled up at him, giving a gesture back to the pier. "I'm an old friend of Captain Harcourt's. I bumped into him on shore, and he has offered me passage back to Zanzibar with my slave here." He heard Usher give a little snort, but it was soft enough that the sailor above wouldn't have heard it. "Captain Harcourt, you say?" Trent nodded. "Indeed, I'm actually a closer friend of his son, Braden, but Captain Harcourt's known me since I was a boy." The sailor still didn't look convinced that he should let them aboard. "Look," Trent dug into the boxes at his feet. "I've got this letter here, giving me permission to come aboard." He held out a page of Harcourt's stationery aloft for the sailor to see. Of course, from this distance, Trent knew the sailor couldn't read the writing, but hopefully he could make out the Harcourt letterhead at the top. Trent's hopes were satisfied a moment later, when the man's countenance relaxed. "Right then, give me a moment." The sailor disappeared, and a few seconds later, the rope ladder fell over the side of the ship. Trent looked at Usher and said quietly, "Ready?" Usher nodded. "Indeed. Fast on my heels now. We'll only have a moment before he'll be demanding to see my reference clearly." Trent took to the ladder, relishing the familiar feel of the buoyant vessel, and swaying rungs testing the agility of his feet. The moment his boots landed on the deck above, he dropped his haversack to one side and stretched his arms languidly over his head. He made a show of bringing relief to an achy back, giving Usher time to join him, and himself time to evaluate the other topside occupants. He'd been right in his assessment, but there was only one other up top. and he was preoccupied with the nets he was mending.
"I'll see that letter of introduction now."
The sailor reached out a hand for it, but Usher was over the gunwale now, so Trent levelled his rifle on the man instead.
"I say what?" "Hush now, lad, for if you make a fuss, I might just have to shoot you so I can deal with the others who will come to your aid."
He motioned with the muzzle of his rifle for the man to lie down on the deck. Usher had wasted no time in depositing RyAnne's violin near the haversack and cat-footing it over to the man repairing the nets, and now he prodded him into a sprawl next to the first man. Trent covered them while Usher bound and gagged them. The moment the two men were secured to the mizzenmast, Trent motioned for Usher to follow him below. Why was it that now when he was close to rescuing RyAnne, his heart started hammering like a bosun repairing a loose deck railing? His mouth felt filled with cotton.
"Please, Father, don't let me be too late this time." Part 4.
In the darkness of her cell, RyAnne felt her way to the bulkhead and put her back to it. She tipped her head against the wood and eased out a sigh.
She'd really done it this time.
No one on the docks would have even known who she was, even if they'd seen her kidnapped. Trent was going to return to the room and find her missing. But by the time he figured out where she was, it would likely be too late. She would be sold to some palace in the east before he could discover what had happened to her. Normally that thought would have sent her into a snit of despair, and yet she found herself feeling rather peaceful. She couldn't quite put her finger on the reason, except that she'd already been through so much and knew all her trials had only made her stronger. They'd made her lean more heavily on her Heavenly Father, and so she would in this instance too. If only she didn't have to leave behind the captain. But even in that, she had at least known love. It would give her a reason to keep on living in the years ahead. And perhaps one day the captain would find her. RyAnne huffed out a disparaging sigh. Now she really was in danger of putting a damper on her determination to hang on to her joy. From behind her there came the snick of a match flaring to life, and warm illumination spilled through a square above her head, growing brighter as the match was apparently used to light a lantern. RyAnne scrambled to her feet and took hold of the bars in the doorway, standing on her tiptoes to peer out and see if she could catch a glimpse of who might be in the passageway. A figure stood outside her cell. The person was obviously studying her, but she could only make out a shadowy form, but they held the bright lantern high and in front of them. RyAnne squinted and shaded her eyes. "Who's there? Can you please help me? I've been taken against my will. I'm the daughter of Dr. RyAnne Hunter from Zanzibar. There is a man in Bagamoyo, Captain Trent Dawson, who will gladly pay you for my release." A low snort preceded the lantern moving a little closer. Just then there was a sound in the passageway, quiet voices, stealthy steps. The lantern light snuffed out, and the quick sound of retreating footsteps was the only evidence that someone had indeed been there. Hinges squeaked.
"RyAnne?"
"Captain!" She could hardly believe her ears. "Is that you? I'm here!"
"Usher, here!" Trent called. "The light!"
A thrill of joy had RyAnne jumping up and down in her cell. "Be careful! Someone was just here!" A soft light grew stronger as Usher's footsteps grew louder, and then he stepped into the room with a lantern held off to one side. It was truly them. RyAnne stretched her hands through the bars, but Trent was all business.
"Someone was here? Which way did they go?"
Her joy deflated somewhat. He was quite put out with her this time. "I don't know exactly. They blew out the lantern before they retreated. But it had to be that way, because you would have run into them if they'd come past you." The captain moved beyond her cell door without so much as a glance her way. He held a rifle in his hands, its barrel glinting light from the lantern Usher held. Usher at least smiled at her.
"You are well, Miss Hunter?"
"I am. Thank you, Usher." The captain and Usher searched the remainder of the compartment. Aided by the lamplight, RyAnne made out one other cell, which was empty, and an assortment of barrels and foodstuffs stacked along the bulkheads and hull, and hanging from overhead beams. But none of them concealed a person, neither behind nor within.
Trent growled. "We look again, Usher."
They commenced their very thorough search a second time, but still not a soul was found hiding in the room. Trent returned to stand before her cell, hands hooked on his hips. He glanced around, then strode over and took down a ring of keys from near the main entrance. His boots clomped loudly as they returned to her cell. As he thrust the key into the lock, he met her gaze through the bars.
"Are you sure you saw someone? It couldn't have been your imagination?"
RyAnne lifted her chin. "Someone was there!" Trent's mouth quirked, and when he swung the door open, he took her hand and yanked her into a fierce embrace. She nestled her head beneath his chin, relishing the feel of his arms around her when only moments earlier she'd been certain she'd never experience this again. She felt a tremor work through him, so he truly was glad to find her safe. "I thought you seemed angry with me." A sound rumbled in his chest.
"Oh, I am. But we can talk about that later. For now, I need to get you to safety."
He took her hand and firmly drew her out into the passageway. When Usher followed them, Trent turned and locked the door shut behind them.
"Wherever they are hiding, that ought to hold them."
He gave the stout oak door a slap with his palm.
"Now come. Harcourt should be returning within the hour. We've a lot to accomplish before then."
Trent led them all up to the quarter-deck. RyAnne heard moaning and glanced up. Her brows rose, for there on the stern castle stood 4 sailors, all bound to the mizzenmast. One more had been bound to the deck's rail. Trent pointed her into the captain's cabin and thoroughly searched it. The room was lavishly appointed with a red velvet settee and silk curtains cordoning off the feather-ticked bunk against the bulkhead. The desk was a golden red hardwood with gorgeous dark grains and intricately etched leaves around the lip. Clawed feet were hewn with the same delicate leaves. A large mahogany statue, crudely carved to look like a giraffe, stood to one side of the door. It was lashed to the bulkhead with a couple loops of rope, presumably to keep it from rolling around in case of a storm. RyAnne ran her hands over the smooth wood and then sank wearily onto the plush settee. "I suppose dealing in slaves must pay quite well." The thought made her feel rather ill. She rubbed the toe of her boot over the place on her ankle that was still healing from the manacles she'd worn for weeks on end. Trent squatted before her and squeezed her shoulder.
"We are going to put a stop to at least this ring. You have my word."
She pressed her lips together and nodded silently. Trent angled his head.
"I need your word that you'll stay in here. There's about to be some nasty business outside, and I can't do what I'll need to do while I'm worrying about your safety."
RyAnne didn't have the energy to even be offended that he didn't trust her to stay put. She only dipped her chin. "You have my word." Trent started away, but a thought occurred to her. "Trent?" He paused and looked at her. "How did you know I was here?"
"Usher saw you kidnapped."
He tilted his head.
"I found the letters."
Her heart pounded. "That's why I was coming to find you. They have hidden words on them. I think he'd—"
"Yes, I know."
He seemed restless, in a hurry to return to the deck. "Did you heed them all?" He nodded.
"And they contain all the information we need to hand these scallywags over to Cornwall."
He left her then, and RyAnne paced the interior of the cabin. Surely her ordeal was almost over. All that remained was for Trent to capture William Harcourt, and then they would sail him and his crew to Commodore Cornwall and turn them over to him. Then she could go home and see Jasmine and Rory and Mother. Her fingers clenched together in dread at the prospect of giving them all the bad news. But there was anticipation, too. It would be good to see them again. She paced past the desk again, trailing her hand across the top. Her fingers bumped over a silver letter opener, and she paused to pick it up. The handle was a carved indigo flower, and the sharp blade gleamed in the light from the porthole. Beyond the cabin door she heard raised voices. She dropped the letter opener back onto the desk and hurried to press her ear to the door. She didn't want to miss a word of what was being said out there. Trent and Usher noticed the longboat leaving the dock at the same moment. 5 men were aboard. A quick glance with a glass revealed that Harcourt was indeed among them. Trent strode over and made sure the rope ladder still hung to the waterline, and then moved to stand behind a capstan. Usher had already taken his own shelter, out of sight. To ensure that all of the men came aboard and none escaped, they would need to let them all aboard the ship before attempting to take them. This was likely the most dangerous part of this whole mission, for it would quickly become obvious that something was amiss when none of their crew met them on the foredeck. He took a calming breath and studied the placid sky above. This was it, for RyAnne, and all those like her who hadn't been given a choice as their freedoms were snatched away. One set of boots thumped to the deck, followed by another.
"I say," one exclaimed, "where is everyone?" "Likely in their cups, with the captain's best ale,"
the other laughed. 2 more sets of boots landed on the deck before the first voice spoke again.
"I'm not liking the feeling of this, Captain." "Aye," Harcourt responded. "Spread out, and see if you can discover what's amiss." "Usher, now!"
Trent yelled as he swung out from behind the capstan and levelled his rifle on the 5 men, one of whom was still straddled over the gunwale. Trent adjusted his aim so that it rested pointedly on Harcourt.
"Tell your men to lay down their arms."
Usher cocked his pistol meaningfully from where he'd appeared on the other side of the group. Flanked on both sides, the men who had automatically reached for their weapons hesitated and looked to their captain. Harcourt was no fool. He slowly lifted his hands into the air.
"Lay down your weapons, men."
As his men complied, and Usher set to tying them up, one by one, William glowered passionately at Trent.
"What is this all about?"
Trent almost laughed.
"Oh, I think you know." "Actually, I have no idea,"
Harcourt retorted, but there was a tremor in his voice that gave away the lie. Trent delayed his response until Usher had finished tying each of Harcourt's 4 men and had tugged Harcourt's hands behind his back. Then Trent tilted his head to assess the impact of his next words.
"I have letters written by the late Ali Khalifa that say otherwise."
He motioned to the gunny sack he'd left near the gunwale.
"Late?"
Harcourt broke off and glanced down to study the sack, his features paling slightly. So perhaps he hadn't been aware that his lackey had been killed.
"I'm afraid he was attacked by a lion that had been stalking the slave caravan he was driving across the continent. It only happened a couple days ago. It's no wonder you hadn't heard yet."
Harcourt's face twisted into dismay.
"I can see the question on your face. You are wondering what happened to all the slaves. I'm afraid I took the liberty of freeing all of them."
Trent felt great satisfaction upon delivering that bit of news. William's face was now nearly as pale as his white shirt.
"It's a nasty business, making profit off the lives of others. So much can go wrong, including letters left behind that reveal far more than you are likely to be comfortable with. Names, places, past interactions."
Since Usher had resumed his vigil over the men with his pistol, Trent took the opportunity to lower his rifle and rub at the skin of his neck dramatically.
"Smuggling slaves is a hanging offense, isn't it, Usher?"
Usher nodded, with a smile. William shuffled his feet uneasily and swallowed visibly.
"Nonsense! What could Ali have to say about me that would result in such impertinent actions on your part?"
Trent couldn't help the smile that tilted his lips.
"He said plenty. And we'll let Commodore Llewellyn Cornwall determine whether my actions are impertinent or justified."
He motioned toward the aft ladder.
"For now, we should get you and your men settled into your quarters below decks."
He tilted Usher a look.
"Usher, I'm thinking that they should make the trip to Cornwall's estate in the same manner than any slaves might have been asked to travel. Don't you? Perhaps that will help them to have a little more compassion the next time, should they somehow weasel their way out of this." "You can't put us down there," one of the crew protested. "There's only be a metre between decks, and I get sick in tight spaces." "Ah, don't worry, lad. You'll be fine."
Trent took his arm in one hand and the nearest sailor's in the other.
"The trip to Llewellyn's will only take a few days from here. What say you, Usher? A week?"
Usher nodded, even though Trent felt quite certain he had no idea how long the trip would actually take. Trent continued making his point by offering the sailor a large grin.
"There, you see? Certainly nothing like a cross-Pacific trip to India or China."
RyAnne covered her mouth and chuckled. The sailor protested loudly.
"But some of the slaves don't survive such crossings."
Trent's rejoinder was almost glib.
"Since you are apparently of such better lineage than the people you seem happy to sell, I'm certain your hearty qualities will see you in good stead and bring you alive and well to the end of our sail. Surviving Newgate, now that's going to be the trick."
RyAnne was about to start laughing again when she heard a floorboard squeak behind her. Her heart lurched and she spun around. Braden stood there, and he had a pistol in his hand.
"Hello, RyAnne."
His boyish smile tilted his lips, but there was something hard about his eyes. She'd known him long enough to recognize that. "Braden!" RyAnne touched her fingers to her throat, her eyes dropping to the pistol. "How did you get in here?" His smile slanted into a look of consternation. He ignored her question, but he stepped to one side, and she could see that behind him a panel in one wall had come open. Braden must have been the one in the storeroom below, and he'd somehow escaped into a passageway that led from that room to this. Braden hooked one thumb into his belt loop and kept the gun trained on her in a lazy fashion.
"I heard that Anne isn't really your mother. That the woman who bore you was a slave of your father's. Is that true?"
RyAnne spread her hands. "'Tis as you say." A muscle pulsed in his jaw.
"How long have you known?"
"All my life." She laced her fingers before her.
"All your life? And yet you let me make a fool of myself over you, as though you were not tainted, not someone on whom I would be ashamed to waste my attentions."
The words were like a slap in RyAnne's face. She took a step back and came up against the cool wood of the cabin door. "I'm still me, Braden. Still the friend you played with in the indigo fields for all those years."
"I never would have been permitted to associate with you, had your true lineage been known."
He shook his head, and his lips twisted into a sneer now.
"No, you are nothing like the woman I thought you to be."
"Simply because of a few drops of blood that flow through my veins that you didn't know about before?"
"Cursed blood."
RyAnne's anger spilled over before she could think better of it. "If we are cursed, it is because of trifling-minded men like you, who feel empowered to abuse simply because the colour of our skin is a little different." She stretched out one arm and yanked up her sleeve until her wrist was revealed. "Look here! What do you see that gives you so much cause to feel superior?" Braden's face transformed into a hard mask of anger. "Impertinence!" He stepped forward and grabbed her by one arm, thrusting his gun into her ribs. His fingers dug so painfully into her arm that she clenched her teeth to hold back a whimper. But there was something she had to know. "So, all those times when you spoke out against slavery? Like at the ball that night? What was that?" Braden leaned in and spoke close to her ear.
"Appearances, dear RyAnne. Appearances. We can't hardly be suspected of smuggling when we are so outspoken against the mean practices of slavery, now, can we?"
"Why would you even resort to smuggling? You certainly aren't in need of the money." A look crossed his face that filled her with realization. "That's it, isn't it? Something happened, and you needed the money. What was it?" Braden shrugged.
"It wasn't so much the need as the want. Father realized there was much greater profit in shipping slaves than indigo, yet the plantation was the perfect cover. We already had the fleet of ships, so—" He shrugged again, as if to say why not.
RyAnne felt a swirl of nausea. Braden took in her face and chuckled, but there was no humour in the sound.
"Now open the door and stay quiet. Your pretty little hide is worth quite a lot, and I'd hate to have to mar it with a bullet."
A shiver of revulsion slipped down RyAnne's back. How could she have been so deceived by this man? She slowly reached out and unlatched the door. Braden thrust her out into the sunlight, sticking fast to her side. Trent stood several paces away, set to descend the aft ladder with two of his prisoners. William Harcourt and a sailor RyAnne didn't recognize. Several others must have already been taken below decks, for RyAnne only saw two other sailors left topside, and they were both still tied to the mizzenmast. Usher also was nowhere to be seen. He had probably taken a couple of the smugglers down ahead of Trent.
"Dawson!" Braden bellowed.
Trent jolted and spun around, his prisoners still clasped in each hand. RyAnne noted that he and Usha had taken time to gag each of the captives with a strip of sheeting, probably to prevent them from conspiring with each other once in the hold. Braden waved his pistol in a quick flash before pressing it back to RyAnne's ribs again.
I'd seriously consider letting my father and his men go. I hear you have quite a fondness for Miss Hunter here.
Even from this distance, RyAnne could see the telltale bunching of Trent's jaw that indicated his irritation. He pinned her with a look that narrowed his grey-green eyes and demanded to know if she'd left the captain's cabin. She supposed she deserved his suspicion, after the many times she'd disregarded his requests. Swallowing, she gave a little shake of her head. He came through a passage in the wall. Trent transferred his gaze back to Braden. Deliberately, he released the two men on either side of him. He bent forward slowly and laid his rifle on the deck, and then raised his hands almost languidly. Williams and the soldier's hands were still bound, but they both quick-stepped several paces away from Trent. The sailor turned to watch the confrontation unfold, but William darted over toward the gunny sack by the rail and kicked it forward, drawing Braden's attention to it with a couple grunts.
What have we here?
Keeping his gun trained on them, Braden took up one corner of the sack and dumped out the contents. The two wooden boxes that RyAnne knew would be full of Khalifa's letters tumbled out. Braden opened the box closest to him and pulled out one of the parchments. RyAnne gasped and her gaze darted to Trent. Those weren't the hidden messages. He nodded subtly, his face calm. RyAnne glanced back toward the rail and saw her violin case there, and from the narrowing of Trent's eyes she knew all the letters must be in with her violin. She looked down to find Braden's attention on her. He glanced back and forth from her to Trent, and then to the violin. RyAnne's heart pounded. Please don't. Braden strode to the violin and hefted it, still keeping them under the eye of his pistol.
Let's see what we have in here, shall we?
He flipped the latches and dumped the contents of the case, violin and all, onto the deck. RyAnne's eyes fell closed as her violin, the silk cover, a bundle of letters, and a leather journal with a Harcourt insignia all tumbled to the boards. A muscle bunched in Trent's jaw, and he looked out toward the horizon for a moment. RyAnne saw him take a slow breath. She had done this. It was her reaction to the fake letters that had clued Braden into the ruse. RyAnne returned her focus to Braden. He had tucked the packet of letters beneath his arm and was flipping through the logbook. What would he do with them? All their evidence against the Harcourts resided in those. Could she distract him? She stepped toward him. Braden, please! You must reconsider what you are doing here!
RyAnne, stay back!
Trent's voice held real fear that made her heed his command.
Not another step, nor another word.
A hard edge had crept into Braden's words that made RyAnne's heart stutter in fear. His hands trembled, and if she had kept moving toward him, there was no telling what he might have done. He looked at his father, lifting the book.
That weasel Khalifa has written down everything.
He dropped the journal and the packet of letters into a nearby cauldron and withdrew a match from his front pocket. RyAnne's eyes dropped closed. Of course, he had matches on his person. He'd just been down in the hold and had lit the lantern. Despair threatened to be her undoing. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. After all their heartache and loss, was it going to come down to this moment? Surely they weren't just going to stand here and watch Braden burn up all their evidence. Braden struck the match against the deck, and it flared to life. RyAnne looked to Trent. What should they do? What could they do with Braden, especially in his current state of mind, training a gun on them? Trent shook his head at her, commanding her without a word to remain still. Braden dropped the match onto the pile of papers, and RyAnne felt all her hopes flag as the flame quickly spread to devour the evidence. Next, Braden picked up both wooden drawers and dropped them on top of the fire. The flames licked greedily at the wood. When the fire had completely consumed the contents of the cauldron, Braden resumed his position by RyAnne, with his pistol gouging into her ribs.
There, now that is taken care of, and we can pick up where we left off.
William was grinning from ear to ear behind his gag and looked quite pleased. RyAnne recalled that when she'd met him on shore, he'd hesitated before he said Braden was not here, no. She realized now that he meant that Braden was aboard the ship. Why hadn't she thought of it and warned Trent? but none of them could have known the ship held secret passages. Another thought struck. Was Braden even the same man that she'd seen with a lantern when she was locked up below?
So that was you that we couldn't find in the storeroom?
Trent's question was the epitome of calm and proved that his thoughts were travelling the same channels as hers.
It was.
Braden sounded quite proud of himself. With a jolt of admiration, RyAnne realised what Trent was doing. They'd just discovered that Braden was working alone.
I should have thought there might be a secret passage. Quite clever of you.
Braden gave a little half bow, keeping his pistol pressed firmly to her side.
Thank you. Just to satisfy my curiosity, where was the entrance to your passageway?
Trent's voice was rather loud for the distance that stretched between them, and RyAnne realised he must be speaking for Usher's benefit. Thank heavens he had been out of sight when she and Braden had stepped out of the captain's cabin. William leaned forward and tried to say something, but his gag was doing its job quite effectively, and Braden grinned languidly.
Don't worry, Father. I've no intention of telling him the location of the secret passage.
William's shoulders slumped in relief, and he grumbled something else indiscernible, but Braden didn't seem to notice. RyAnne's heart pounded with despair. If only he had told them the location, Usher might have been able to use it to help them. Now he would be no use to them, for there was no way for him to come on deck without Braden seeing him. Braden was caught up in his own cleverness.
So, Dawson, it appears you are at a disadvantage. First you are going to untie my father and his crew, and then we are going to sail out of this harbour. And when we get far enough out, we are going to dump you overboard. He laughed. I hope you can swim. And if I refuse?
Trent's voice remained calm. He folded his arms and stuffed his fists into his armpits, looking for all the world like he planned to remain that way for quite some time. RyAnne realised he was doing all he could to delay. Braden's laugh was almost hysterical now.
You may refuse to swim, if you like.
Trent only looked at him, allowing the moments to stretch. Braden stopped his cackling as suddenly as he'd begun.
Get on with untying them.
RyAnne took a breath as Trent slowly started toward William. Trent seemed set on delay, and delaying was something she could help with. She only prayed Braden's gun wouldn't go off by accident. She felt her hands grow clammy at just the thought. Trent would likely instruct her to keep out of it, but she could do this, and hopefully it would give Trent or Usher the time to do something. Giving a little whimper, she pressed the back of one hand to her forehead, rolled her eyes up, and slumped into the best faint she could conjure. She'd never actually fainted herself, but she'd seen Mother do it a time or two.
What the devil?
Braden exclaimed, clutching at her as she collapsed. RyAnne was thankful for the resistance of his arm that had somewhat broken her fall, and also thankful to note that her person was still intact without any bullet holes. She heard Trent's boots thumping across the deck. He was probably set on taking advantage of Braden while he was distracted, but in the next moment Braden exclaimed,
Stop right there, Dawson, before I put a shot through her pretty skull.
RyAnne felt the cold press of a muzzle against her forehead, and it was all she could do to keep herself from flinching.
I've stopped. Please, just help her.
Trent's voice sounded distraught. A trace of guilt washed through RyAnne. Did Trent know she was pretending? She dared not open her eyes to offer him assurances. She lay as still as possible, hardly even daring to inhale.
Is she breathing? Trent persisted. Please! You have to check to see if she's breathing.
RyAnne shallowed her breaths as much as she could and forced herself to remain limp. She felt Braden lean over her at the same moment she heard William grunt out an exclamation. Braden started to pull away. What? There was a loud, hollow thunk, and then Braden's dead weight collapsed atop her. RyAnne's eyes flew open. Trent and Usher both leaned over her, peering concernedly into her face. Usher held the large wooden giraffe from the captain's cabin in his hands. William's cry of anguished frustration was loud despite the cloth stuck in his mouth, and RyAnne heard his footsteps slapping the deck. Trent must have heard them too, because he stood, spun around, and in one smooth motion brought his fist into Harcourt's midsection. William squawked and bent double, coughing and wheezing through the cloth. Trent guided the man to his knees and then eased him over till he was on his side.
Lay here and catch your breath while I tie up your son.
William's shoulders slumped in defeat. RyAnne could tell from his expression that he knew he'd been beaten. With his hands tied securely behind him the way they were, there wasn't much resistance he could offer. RyAnne almost felt sorry for the man. Trent stood and came back to her. There was a glimmer of admiration in his eyes when they met hers.
Usher, help me get Harcourt off of her, would you? Nice hit, by the way. Remind me never to come up behind you in a dark corridor.
Usher chuckled.
Long time coming.
Each man took one of Braden's arms and hauled him up and off of her. He hung limply between them, and when she sat up, she could see a large lump forming on the back of his head. The men laid him out, face down on the deck, and while Usher set about tying him up, Trent turned back to her. He helped her sit up and then took her shoulders and peered into her face.
Trouble, RyAnne, simply has a way of sniffing you out. Are you all right?
She nodded, even though a tremble was starting in the vicinity of her knees now that the danger was past. Trent pulled her into a firm embrace that revealed all the fear untethering from inside him. She felt his arm shaking. She eased back until she could look him in the eye. I'm fine, Trent. I'm fine. But we lost all our evidence. I'm so sorry I drew his attention to the violin. He shook his head and tapped his temple.
If there is one thing managing a fleet of ships with my father all my life has taught me, it's to never put all your eggs in one basket.
He glanced over at William, who glowered back passionately. Trent lifted his shirt slowly and pulled a parchment from beneath his belt.
You see, RyAnne, it's not really written evidence we need to convict the Harcourts in a court of law. It's the testimony of people, and
he flicked the paper with a smile of satisfaction.
I have all the names Khalifa mentioned written out right here. All we have to do is offer a few of them deals, and I'm sure we'll have all the testimonial corroboration that we'll need.
Trent stood and hauled William to his feet.
Because you see, those who live on the wrong side of the law don't trust each other. If all of them kept quiet, well then, we'd have a problem. But I'm guessing tongues will be wagging before a fortnight has passed.
William glanced out over the water and uttered a sound that could only be interpreted as a curse.
For shame, William! A lady is present.
Trent admonished him with a grin in RyAnne's direction. Holding on to William's arm with one hand, he squeezed her shoulder with the other.
Why don't you go on into the cabin? Usher and I will get these gentlemen settled in the hold, and then we'll be on our way to Cornwall's.
RyAnne retrieved her violin and tucked it carefully back into its case. She was relieved to see that it didn't seem to have suffered any damage. As she once more sank into the settee in the captain's cabin, she noticed the silver letter opener that had been on the desk lying on the floor near where the wooden giraffe had once been lashed to the wall. Usher had obviously found the hidden passageway, and then, upon arriving in the captain's cabin, used the sharp blade to slice through the thin ropes, lashing the giraffe to the bulkhead. RyAnne could hardly believe that their search might have finally come to an end. There was only one additional thing that could make her feel more complete than she felt right now, and that was to see her family again.
Part 5.
Trent had been correct about the wagging tongues. Commodore Cornwall had immediately sent fast ships to Zanzibar to round up the people on Trent's list, and he hadn't encountered any trouble getting most of them to talk. Their testimony would be the nail that sealed the lid of the Harcourts' coffins. Trent and RyAnne now stood on the shore below Commodore Llewellyn Cornwall's estate. The Commodore was about to board his ship to take the captives to England for a trial, and there was a great deal of glee glimmering in his gaze. He stretched his hand out to Trent.
Once again, I thank you, Captain, for a job well done. Her Majesty will be most pleased that we have shut down this ring. I've already sent ships to the smuggling locations you remembered from Khalifa's correspondence. I'm sure we will have it wrapped up within a fortnight. Good. I hope so. Before I go,
he held out a hefty bag.
Your promised payment.
Trent accepted the bag with a nod of thanks. RyAnne was surprised when Commodore Cornwall turned to her next.
Young lady, I'm sure you've had quite an ordeal, but I wonder if you might consider sailing to England and sharing your story before Parliament. It is stories such as yours that help in the forming of new and better laws. Whom shall I send, child?
RyAnne felt a chill pepper her skin, as an answer formed almost immediately in her spirit. Here I am, father. Send me. To the Commodore she responded, I think I would be very happy to do that. If you set it up, I will go, providing, she turned a look on Trent, that my soon-to-be husband agrees to sail me there. Trent laughed.
I'm beginning to realize that there won't be much I can deny you.
The Commodore's chuckle was hearty. He slapped Trent on the back.
That's as it should be, lad. As it should be.
To RyAnne he said, with a bow over her hand.
I will arrange for you to stand before Parliament next session, if that is suitable to you.
RyAnne lifted a brow to Trent. He nodded. She turned back to the Commodore. Next session will be most suitable. Thank you for asking me. The Commodore waved away RyAnne's thanks.
'Tis I who should be thanking you. After all, you are a beautiful and well-educated young woman, who, according to the laws of the land, ought to be stripped of all your rights and left to the whims of others. But thoughts on that are changing, and you've been through so much. You will be the perfect one to speak directly to the heart of the matter. Sometimes it takes the humanizing of an ethereal conceptualization to open people's eyes to truth. Perhaps all the severe hardships you've encountered will aid the politicians in opening their eyes to change, eh?
He patted her hand.
Well, I'd best be off, before the tide leaves without me.
With a hearty wave over his shoulder, he climbed aboard the dinghy that would row him out to his ship, which was anchored in the deeper waters farther out. But the moment he walked away, RyAnne dropped to her knees with a gasp.
What is it?
Trent sank to his haunches before her.
Are you hurt?
RyAnne shook her head, but placed one hand over her heart. No. I'm just so overwhelmed with all the answers God just heaped upon me. Things I've been praying about for so long. Do you remember me telling you earlier that I felt the Lord was asking me to go somewhere, but I wasn't sure where that was? Trent nodded. The moment Commodore Cornwall asked me to go to England, I had my answer. Trent smiled with understanding. And do you remember when I asked you how a good God could be defended in the face of such misery as I had witnessed? Again he nodded. RyAnne threw up her hands. I've been in such turmoil, trying to understand how a good and loving God could allow such terrible things to happen. I understand man's free will plays into it, as well as people who may be called to do good things, but choose not to respond. But for my part, I can honestly say that it was all for this moment. She gestured to where the Commodore was just ascending the ladder to the deck of his ship. If I hadn't followed Papa from Zanzibar to here, and if I hadn't been captured and hadn't gone through all those hardships, I wouldn't have a story to tell to Parliament. But because of my hardships, laws might be changed. Others' lives might be bettered. She could no longer hold the tears at bay. And for that to happen, I would go through these last torturous months all over again.
Come here.
Trent stood and pulled her to him, tucking her against his chest. He rested his chin atop her head.
Months ago, when I had first taken on the task of escorting your father to the village, I questioned the veracity of his call. I wondered if God really called people to go to specific places, and figured your father ought to be content to go to the places that were easier for him to reach. But he insisted that it was to that exact village he must go. I think looking back now we can see how the Lord wove all those varied coloured threads to the accomplishing of his good purpose. Meeting Keiko here at Cornwall's, Keiko's father being the chief of the exact village your father was called to, you saving Nyanja's life, and us learning that she was from that very same tribe also, the confrontation with Wankulu on our way to the village that eventually led to your capture. All of those strands came together and brought us to this place of answers.
RyAnne sighed, but there were so many tragedies that happened along the way that are still unexplained. Trent rumbled a sound of agreement.
But the Lord is a master artist, and he's weaving so many stories other than just our own together. Just because we can't see where the threads of trials or tragedies lead for someone else, it doesn't mean that God isn't using them to perfect his tapestry.
RyAnne felt a pure wave of peace for the first time in many months. She wasn't guaranteed a life of no trials, but she was guaranteed that she served a God who loved all of mankind beyond measure, and that he was trustworthy and loving. He did indeed work all things for the good of those who loved him. RyAnne sighed in near-perfect contentment. Trent. Take me home. Trent eased her back and pressed his forehead to hers.
On one condition.
Her lips tilted up at the gleam of mischief in his eyes. What's that?
Marry me right now,
he said.
Before you decide to run off to a cockfight, or a crocodile tries to attack you, or another slave driver captures you, or you simply change your mind.
RyAnne laughed. She knew he was teasing, but she played along. She gave him a be-serious look. There's not a chance of me changing my mind, Captain. But I can't marry you this moment. Who would perform the ceremony? He grunted.
As a captain, I'm qualified, but I don't suppose I can officiate my own wedding. As soon as we land on Zanzibar, then?
He pumped his brows hopefully. This time RyAnne batted his arm. I need time to sew a wedding dress, and it might be nice to invite our families.
You could wear a gunny sack for all I care, he grumbled.
He looked at her intently.
How fast do you think you can get your family to the beach after we dock? Garrett has a fast horse and is used to taking my orders, so I can get him there right snappy.
RyAnne laughed at his antics. The beach, is it?
He
slid his fingers down her arms until they intertwined with her own.
Looking over the Indian Ocean, where I first realized I wanted to marry you.
RyAnne's brows lifted. When was that?
After I'd found you nearly dead in my longboat and took you into the ocean to cool you off. You woke up in my arms, and I knew right then that I would do anything to keep you safe.
His thumbs grazed the sides of her hands, and he pulled her closer. Her heart was so full of joy it was near to bursting. She revelled in the feel of his arms around her, curling her fingers to intertwine with his at the small of her back. I'm quite content right here, Captain. Mayhap there is no need for a wedding at all. She grinned at him cheekily. He growled, but a good-natured smile tipped up the corners of his lips and crinkled the corners of his eyes.
Perhaps I'll have to kidnap you myself.
He scooped her up and started down the beach. RyAnne laughed. Let's have none of that. I've experienced quite enough of kidnappings for a lifetime. Thank you very much. How about Saturday next?
Now you're talking sense, he said, and then he kissed her.
Exactly 1 week after the Wasp docked in the Stone Town harbour, RyAnne sat aboard a topless carriage with her wedding dress tucked in about her, as they headed toward the white sanded beach Trent had chosen for their special day. Vala and Halime, her friends, the princesses of Zanzibar, sat across from her on the bench next to Jasmine. And Rory sat next to her, plastered to his side of the carriage on instructions from Jasmine that he not crumple even a frill of her lace. The driver pulled the carriage to a stop at the head of the path, and Rory helped the girls climb down. A small stone wall separated the road from the beach below and prevented RyAnne from seeing the seats they'd carefully arranged in the sand the evening before. Seats that were at this very moment filled with guests who were here to celebrate with them. As RyAnne waited for her turn to alight, she took in her surroundings. She wanted to savor every moment of this day. The day couldn't have been more beautiful. She closed her eyes and memorized the sounds all around her. The shushing of the waves against the shore, the bird song warbling through the air, the wind whispering secrets to the palm leaves overhead. Thank you, Father, for your many blessings.
If I don't get you down there soon, it is reported that Trent is going to wear a trench in the sand. Rory chuckled.
RyAnne opened her eyes to see him stretching out one hand to help her down. The moment her feet were on the ground, Jasmine swooped in, brushed Rory aside, and set to adjusting ribbons and straightening lace. She gave one last glance and then stepped back with a satisfied nod. Vala and Halime opened the boot of the carriage and pulled out the bouquets they had carefully laid out before leaving the house 30 minutes ago. RyAnne suddenly felt all a tremble with nervousness, like she hadn't felt since she'd been chained to a tree while while thinking Trent was dead. "You're sure I look okay?" She bent and fussed with the hem of the dress, even as Jasmine thrust into her hands her bouquet of bougainvillea and bird of paradise they'd cut from Mother's garden just this morning. "You couldn't be more beautiful," Jasmine reassured. "Now come along. The girls and I will walk down ahead of you. Bishop Tozer is already waiting at the front. And the last time I checked, there was a very handsome groom waiting rather impatiently at the end of the aisle." RyAnne smiled at that. Jasmine led Vala and Halame off, and RyAnne knew they would be headed to the seats that had been saved for them next to Mother. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward onto the stone pathway that led down to the beach. Rory smiled at her and stretched out his arm.
"One look at you, and Captain Trent Dawson will be lucky if he can keep breathing."
"Let's just hope I don't lose the breakfast Mother forced me to eat while we're walking down the aisle." RyAnne shook out her hands nervously. Rory laughed. He gave Bishop Tozer a signal then, and the orchestra struck up the music. RyAnne hadn't been joking about losing her breakfast, but the moment they stepped past the wall and her eyes landed on Trent, all of her nervousness washed away. He was dressed in the same ballroom finery that he'd worn on that long-ago night of the Harcourts Ball. So much had grown between them from that moment to this. Mother was the first one to stand as Rory started them down the aisle. And as RyAnne met her gaze, a bubble of thankfulness swelled in her chest. The day she and Trent had arrived back in Stonetown, Mother had still been abed recovering from cholera. But RyAnne had gone to her immediately and apologized for her part in the pain Mother must have been feeling for all these years. Mother had apologized for her own prickliness, and they had shared tears over the loss of Papa. Mother had seemed to be much softer after that, and RyAnne couldn't be more thankful than to see her smiling from the front row. Though she knew she would likely never share the same relationship with Mother that Jasmine did, she was thankful to at least have taken a step in a positive direction. Usher was there toward the back, and even though he did not smile, there was a softness about his expression that she didn't remember seeing before. Trent had hired him as one of the crewmen on the newest ship he'd purchased from his father, who was hoping to turn his entire fleet over to Trent soon. John Knight, Trent's bosun, was there with Dabu, Trent's youngest crewman, squirming by his side. 2 weeks after the village was sacked, John had received word that his captain had been killed, and RyAnne captured. He and the crew of the Bee had sadly made their way back to Stonetown to collect Garrett, and had arrived only hours after Trent had docked. RyAnne almost giggled now as she remembered how gleeful the padded bosun had been to find them both alive, and well, he quite nearly danced an entire jig. Vala's attention upon them was rapt, but RyAnne wasn't fooled. Her friend was looking at Rory, not her. And from his seat in the front row, on Trent's side of the assemblage, Garrett wasn't even pretending to look at her. His gaze had moved across the aisle, where it rested upon her sister. Jasmine was trying valiantly to keep her focus on RyAnne, but her gaze kept slipping back to the man across the way. And when Garrett winked quite boldly, RyAnne giggled to see Jasmine's face match the bougainvillea of her bouquet with such perfection. Her gaze returned to Trent then, and she couldn't remember the last time she had felt this much happiness. Rory handed her off, and she slipped her fingers into the warm, strong grasp of the man who would always hold her heart. His grey-green eyes crinkled at the corners, and she heard his soft sigh of contentment as he tugged her closer and tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. The details of the ceremony were fuzzy. She must have mumbled her lines in all the right places, however, for suddenly Bishop Tozer was pronouncing them husband and wife. Trent turned her to face him. He swept a quick, appreciative glance down the length of her, before he drew her into his arms with a pump of his brows. And RyAnne knew she would always remember the first kiss they shared as husband and wife, standing on the white sanded beach with their dearest friends and family, cheering wildly behind them. We hope you have enjoyed this final episode in the Sonnets of the Spice Isle series. If you would like to listen to more of Lynnette Bonner's audiobooks, look for them on Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. This has been The Joy of the Morning, a serialized historical Christian romance.
Sonnets of the Spice Isle, Book 6. Written by Lynnette Bonner. Narrated by Mary Sarah Agliotta. Copyright 2016 by Lynnette Bonner. Production copyright 2017 by Lynnette Bonner.